Welcome, restless minds, to another chapter from Hollow Midnight, where we delve into the quiet absurdities of forgotten histories. If you find yourself gently drifting, or perhaps just wonderfully distracted by the mundane, consider pressing that subscribe button for more tales that aren't quite sleep-inducing, but certainly aren't exciting either. Tonight, we begin a new narrative, exploring the delicate dance between arrogance and unintended consequence. This is Chapter 1, The Unassuming Servant. In the vast and somewhat draughty hall of Blackwood Manor, where the scent of aged timber and damp earth perpetually clung to the air, there lived a quiet soul named Agnes. Agnes was, to all outward appearances, a fixture as unremarkable as the wainscoting that lined the peeling walls, or the persistent echo that followed the footsteps of the manor's dwindling inhabitants. Her days were a meticulous ballet of domesticity, a steady rhythm of polished silver, swept floors, and, most notably, perfectly made beds. For many years, perhaps more than anyone cared to count or remember, Agnes had been the principal bed-making servant in a household that clung to the vestiges of its former grandeur, like a forgotten cobweb to a chandelier. She moved through the manor's silent corridors with a whisper of starched apron and a near-total absence of sound, her stout, sensible shoes barely disturbing the dust motes that danced in the slivers of sunlight, piercing the tall, begrimed windows. Her hair, a practical grey braid, was always coiled tightly at the nape of her neck, and her hands, though calloused from years of scrubbing and hauling, possessed an almost surgical precision when it came to tautening a sheet or fluffing a pillow. No wrinkle dared to mar the pristine surface of a bed made by Agnes. No lump disturbed the plumpness of a goose-down cushion. It was a craft, a devotion, a small, quiet rebellion against the encroaching decay of the manor itself. Agnes was a creature of habit and observation. Her eyes, often downcast, missed nothing. The chipped porcelain of the chamber pot, the faint wine stain on Lord Ashworth's nightshirt, the subtle tremble in Lady Eleanor's hand as she reached for her morning tea, these were the minutiae that formed the fabric of her silent world. She heard the hushed whispers from behind closed doors, the clipped tones of command from masters who rarely looked her in the eye, and the occasional sharp dismissal of her presence, as if she were a piece of furniture that had suddenly decided to creak in protest. Yet her face remained, invariably, a smooth, unreadable mask. Her features were plain, neither beautiful nor homely, and her expression was consistently neutral, a canvas upon which the world could project its own assumptions. She rarely spoke, offering only quiet affirmations or brief, factual answers when directly addressed, her voice a low, unassuming murmur that seemed to evaporate into the heavy tapestries. This reticence, combined with her efficiency and lack of outward complaint, led the manor's inhabitants to largely dismiss her as a simple, diligent hand, devoid of much thought or feeling beyond the immediate task. A useful cog in the household machinery, certainly, but one that could be freely ignored, or, if the mood struck, occasionally used as an outlet for a particularly foul humor. It was this dismissal, this casual disregard for the mind behind the methodical movements, that formed the fertile ground for something far less benign than mere diligence. For while Agnes presented an outward facade of placid acceptance, her internal landscape was a rich tapestry of sharp wit and an incredibly, almost preternaturally, long memory. Every slight, every cutting remark, every haughty glare that she was made to endure was not forgotten. It was, rather, meticulously filed away, categorized and cross-referenced in the quiet chambers of her mind. These were not memories that festered with immediate anger or resentment. Rather, they were like carefully pressed flowers in a forgotten almanac, each one retaining its precise detail, its specific hue of disdain or arrogance. She did not brood in a conventional sense. Instead, she observed, she analyzed, and she catalogued. She understood the intricate power dynamics of the manor, the fragile egos that hid behind inherited titles, the desperate attempts to maintain an illusion of control. And she knew, with an unsettling clarity, that those who truly held power were often the ones least seen, least heard, and least acknowledged. Consider, for instance, the incident with the threadbare blanket, nearly a decade ago. Lord Ashworth, then a younger, more vigorous man given to theatrical outbursts, had thrown a perfectly good, if slightly matted, blanket across the room, declaring it an insult to his noble sensibilities, and demanding that Agnes produce one fit for a man of his standing. Agnes had simply retrieved it, folded it neatly, and placed it back on the foot of the bed, her expression unchanged. Lord Ashworth, satisfied with her apparent subservience, had promptly forgotten the entire exchange. But Agnes had not. She remembered the precise angle of his chin, the contemptuous curl of his lip, the way the light had caught the dust motes disturbed by his dramatic gesture. It was a minor incident, easily dismissed by anyone else, yet for Agnes, it was another tiny, perfectly preserved specimen in her mental collection of slights. Or the time Lady Eleonora, convinced her morning tea had been prepared with water from the wrong well, an imagined slight, as Agnes sourced all water from the single, undeniably pure spring, had loudly proclaimed Agnes' intellect to be no deeper than a puddle after a summer shower. Agnes had simply bowed her head, retrieved the offending teacup, and returned with an identical one, poured from the very same kettle. Lady Eleonora, appeased by the perceived act of correction, had preened. Agnes, however, had committed the phrase to memory, along with the precise shade of red on Lady Eleonora's indignant cheeks. These incidents, small and insignificant as they were to the perpetrators, accumulated within Agnes like grains of sand in a very large hourglass. There was no visible indication of this internal archive. Her step remained even, her breathing quiet, her hands perpetually busy. She moved through the manor like a phantom, her presence acknowledged only by the crispness of the sheets and the absence of dust on the mahogany. The others, immersed in their own grand narratives and petty grievances, saw only a servant, a tool, an extension of the manor itself, as inanimate and predictable as the grandfather clock in the hall. They did not see the mind that catalogued their weaknesses, their vanities, their precise vulnerabilities. They did not perceive the quiet, steady hum of an intellect that processed their every word, every gesture, and every perceived slight, filing them away for a future that they, in their blissful ignorance, could not possibly foresee. The true nature of Agnes, the formidable intelligence that lay dormant beneath her unassuming exterior, was the manor's best-kept secret, and its most dangerous one. The meticulous precision with which she made a bed was merely a reflection of the precision with which she observed the world around her, and the calm, unwavering patience with which she awaited the opportune moment for a very particular sort of rectification. Her quiet demeanor was not born of meekness, but of a profound understanding that silence held more power than any shouted command. Her long memory was not a burden, but a finely honed instrument, waiting for the right note to strike. And the bed, that soft, inviting rectangle of linen and feathers, was far more than just a place to rest one's head. In the hands of Agnes, it possessed an almost symbolic significance, a blank canvas upon which the subtle threads of fate could be rearranged, one careful tuck at a time. The world of Blackwood Manor, with its fading glory and its self-absorbed inhabitants, was about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones you never bother to truly see. They were, in essence, sleeping in a bed of their own making, quite literally. Chapter 2. A Nobleman's Folly, the air in Blackwood Manor. On that particular morning was thick with the scent of damp stone and a lingering hint of yesterday's wood smoke. A familiar atmospheric blend that had seeped into the very fibers of Agnes's being over the decades. It was a day like any other, characterized by the methodical turning of duties, the quiet hum of an ancient house slowly decaying, and the perpetually elevated complaints of its residents. Agnes had, as was her immutable routine, risen before the first true blush of dawn, her movements as quiet and precise as the ticking of a well-oiled clock. She had prepared the fires, ensured the kitchen staff were stirring with appropriate diligence, and then, with her small basket of linen squares and polishing cloths, she had begun her rounds of the bedchambers, a silent spectre of order amidst the waking chaos. Her final stop, as always, was Lord Ashworth's grand bedchamber, a room that, despite its impressive size and heavy furnishings, seemed perpetually on the verge of succumbing to a subtle yet pervasive disarray. Lord Ashworth himself, a man whose constitution seemed perpetually at odds with the demands of even the most minor discomfort, stirred from his slumber with the disgruntled grumble of a half-unfurled thundercloud. Wah! The pale, watery light of a Blackwood Manor morning, filtered through the thick leaded panes of his bedchamber window, did little to mollify his nascent irritation. He shifted, a ponderous heap of silk nightshirt and inherited grievances, attempting to find a position of ultimate repose in the very bed Agnes had so painstakingly prepared the previous evening. It was a bed, by any objective standard, of exemplary quality. The goose-down mattress, though ancient, had been artfully fluffed to a cloud-like consistency. The crisp linen sheets, bleached to a startling white, were stretched taut across its surface, with nary a whisper of a wrinkle, and the pillows, precisely aligned, offered a comforting mound for even the most demanding of noble heads. Yet Lord Ashworth, possessed of a sensitivity to minor imperfections that bordered on the preternatural, detected a flaw. It was not a prominent flaw, certainly not one visible to the uncritical eye of an ordinary observer, but to Lord Ashworth it was an affront, a betrayal of the highest order. He pursed his lips, a small, involuntary shiver of displeasure rippling through his substantial frame. There, beneath his left shoulder blade, an almost imperceptible irregularity disturbed the otherwise flawless landscape of his sleeping arrangements. A tiny ripple, perhaps caused by a shifted feather that had migrated minutely within the down, or a minute, unseen crease in the lower sheet, barely wider than the seam of a spider's web. To anyone else, it would be nothing. To Lord Ashworth, it was a mountain, an insurmountable obstacle to true, aristocratic rest. It was, in his estimation, a direct assault on his fundamental right to an unblemished night's sleep, a right bestowed upon him by birthright, and reinforced by his considerable, if somewhat diminishing, wealth. He pushed himself up, his face a rumpled canvas of indignation. His eyes, small and dark beneath heavy brows, scanned the room with a practiced air of discontent, finally landing on Agnes as she quietly folded a freshly laundered serviette on the dressing table. He cleared his throat, a theatrical rumble that seemed designed to startle any lesser being into immediate obeisance. Agnes, however, merely turned her head slowly, her expression as placid as the surface of an undisturbed pond. Agnes, Lord Ashworth's voice, though still thick with sleep, carried a sharp, piercing edge that was usually reserved for errant stable boys, or particularly stubborn clogs in the privy. "Come here, woman, at once." Agnes, without a word, set down the serviette and moved towards the bed, her step soft upon the worn Persian rug. She kept her gaze fixed on a point just past Lord Ashworth's left ear, a technique she had perfected over years to maintain an appearance of deference without ever actually meeting the often unpleasant eyes of her employers. Lord Ashworth, meanwhile, had begun to prod the offending spot on the mattress with a disgruntled finger, as if expecting the material itself to confess its imperfection. "Look here, Agnes," he huffed, his voice rising in pitch with each word. "Just look at this atrocity. This lump. I swear, a man could break his back on such a poorly prepared pallet. I tossed and turned all night, felt every single irregularity, every misguided feather. It was like attempting to sleep upon a bag of cobblestones, I tell you. An absolute disgrace. He punctuated his complaint with a dramatic flick of his wrist, as if shooing away an irritating fly. One would think that after all these years, you might have mastered the simple art of arranging a few feathers and a length of linen. But no, it seems even the most basic of tasks eludes your grasp. Frankly, Agnes, your bed-making is an insult to the very concept of rest. It is in basic and rest are non-new to me, and it's crude. Not fit for a pig in a sty, let alone a nobleman of my standing. He paused, perhaps expecting a gasp, a stammered apology, a frantic rush to rectify the perceived slight. Agnes stood perfectly still, her hands clasped loosely in front of her starched apron. Her plain features remained utterly unreadable. Not a flicker of emotion disturbed the calm surface of her face. She simply looked at the bed, then at the precise spot Lord Ashworth's finger had indicated. The lump he referred to was so infinitesimally small, so utterly negligible, that a less discerning observer might have dismissed it as a trick of the light, or perhaps a dust particle magnified by noble indignation. But Agnes saw it, of course. She saw the phantom ripple where none should be, a testament not to her failing, but to the nobleman's overactive imagination and boundless capacity for manufactured grievance. Lord Ashworth, misinterpreting her silence as shame or perhaps a dim-witted acknowledgment of her alleged incompetence, continued his tirade, warming to his subject with the self-satisfied zeal of a preacher, addressing a particularly sinful congregation. "I pay good coin," he declared, drawing himself up to his full height, which was considerable, though somewhat softened by a generous paunch, good, honest coin, for the upkeep of this household, for the provision of basic comfort. And what do I receive in return? A mattress that feels as though it were stuffed with last year's turnips. A bed that mocks my very desire for repose. It beggars belief, Agnes. Truly, it beggars belief. One would think, given your many years of service, that a modicum of skill might have developed. But, alas, it seems true talent is reserved for those with a bit more cerebral capacity. He finished with a sniff, a final disdainful dismissal of her capabilities, and by extension her very intellect. He watched her for a moment, a superior smirk playing on his lips, satisfied that his words had found their mark, that he had asserted his dominance over the simple, unthinking servant. Then, with a flourish, he turned to retrieve his dressing-gown from the ornate valet stand, his back to her, dismissing her utterly. Agnes did not flinch. She did not sigh. She did not even blink, or so it seemed. Her eyes, however, were wide open internally. The words rudimentary, crude, not fit for a pig, and cerebral capacity were not merely heard. They were captured, dissected, and filed with the meticulous precision of a seasoned archive. She noted the rasp in his voice, the precise shade of purple that had crept into his jowls, the self-congratulatory gleam in his eyes before he had turned away. She registered the almost imperceptible tremor in his hand as he reached for his silk dressing-gown, a tremor that hinted at a deeper fragility beneath the bluster. She observed the way the light from the window caught the dust motes dancing around his head, forming a halo of oblivious arrogance. And she catalogued, with a quiet, unwavering certainty, the exact point of the lump he had so dramatically pointed out, understanding perfectly that its physical existence was entirely secondary to its function as a vehicle for his boundless conceit. This particular insult, unlike some of the more general dismissals she had endured, was specific, pointed, and directed squarely at her most perfected craft, the making of a bed. It was a testament to his profound lack of observation. His inability to perceive the sheer artistry and dedication that went into the crispness of the sheets, the perfect plumpness of the pillows, the almost surgical precision of the tucked corners. For Agnes, the bed was not merely a place of rest. It was a canvas, a silent declaration of her mastery, a small, impeccable island of order in a world of increasing entropy. And for him to declare it crude, to suggest her hands lacked the cerebral capacity to perform such a task, was not just an insult. It was a profound misjudgment of her very essence. The incident joined the long, silent ledger in her mind, alongside the threadbare blanket and the imagined wrong well water. But this entry had a weight to it, a particular gravity. It settled, not with a dull thud of anger, but with the quiet click of a tumbler's falling into place. Agnes was not a woman given to outbursts, nor to immediate retribution. Her vengeance, when it came, was a slow, simmering stew, rich with the flavor of ironic justice, subtle in its delivery, and utterly devastating in its cumulative effect. The arrogant nobleman, entirely unaware of the vast, intricate network of slights he had woven for himself, had just added a very significant thread to the tapestry of his own impending discomfort. He was, in his profound obliviousness, entirely at the mercy of the quiet woman who now stood behind him, her hands still clasped, her eyes still unreadable, absorbing every last detail of his folly. As Lord Ashworth left the room with a final dismissive wave of his hand, striding off to inflict his morning grumbles on the breakfast table, Agnes moved towards the bed. She bent low, her nimble fingers investigating the precise spot he had indicated. There was indeed the most minuscule of disturbances, a slight shift in the padding that could be rectified with a single, expert pat d'eau. She smoothed the sheet, plumped the pillow, her movements efficient and practiced, erasing the phantom lump that had so disturbed his lordship's delicate sensibilities. As she worked, a faint, almost imperceptible smile played at the corners of her mouth, a secret amusement known only to herself. The bed was now, once again, perfect. But the seeds of discontent, sown by a careless tongue and nurtured by a profound lack of awareness, had taken root, and their harvest, though slow in coming, would be meticulously reaped. The nobleman had spoken of a rudimentary skill, unaware that the true skill lay not in the perfectly made bed, but in the perfectly executed plan that would unfold, one precise, deliberate action at a time. His comfortable slumber, so casually threatened by a phantom lump, was about to become far more profoundly disturbed by the silent, discerning mind of Agnes. He had no idea of the quiet, patient intelligence that now considered the intricacies of his future discomfort, a future woven with the very threads he had so carelessly dismissed. Chapter 3. The first subtle retaliation. The rhythm of Blackwood Manor remained, outwardly, precisely as it always had been, a slow, creaking waltz of predictable domesticity. The sun rose, indifferent to the moods of its inhabitants, casting its pale, grudging light through the ancient windows. The cook grumbled over the morning fire, the stable-boy whistled off-key, and Agnes, quiet as ever, moved through the echoing halls, her hands already familiar with the day's exacting tasks. Yet within Agnes, a new current flowed, a quiet, purposeful hum that was entirely her own. The slight, the casual dismissal of her artistry, the arrogant declaration of her lack of cerebral capacities words had not merely been recorded in her meticulous mental ledger. They had been refined, distilled, and converted into a blueprint for a very particular kind of discomfort. Her vengeance would not be loud, nor obvious, nor something that could be pointed to and immediately rectified. It would be a creeping, insidious presence, a persistent whisper of unease woven into the very fabric of Lord Ashworth's nights. That evening, as the shadows lengthened and the manor settled into its nightly creaks and groans, Agnes performed her ritual of bed-making in Lord Ashworth's chamber. Her movements were, as always, fluid and precise, a ballet of practiced efficiency. She smoothed the bottom sheet, pulling it taut across the thick mattress, ensuring every corner was tucked with military precision. The top sheet followed, then the heavy wool blankets, each layer meticulously aligned. Finally, the pillows were fluffed, plumped, and placed with what appeared to be perfect symmetry. To any observer, the bed would have seemed flawless, a haven of crisp linen and comforting down, identical in every visible aspect to the perfection she had always delivered. But Agnes was no ordinary bedmaker, and her perfection on this night contained a carefully calibrated imperfection. As her fingers brushed the vast expanse of the top sheet, a muscle memory honed over decades whispered to her the exact degree of tension required for absolute smoothness. Instead of pulling it with a customary, uniform firmness, she applied a fraction more tension to the sheet's far left corner, a minute, almost imperceptible tug that subtly skewed the inherent bias of the weave. The result was not a wrinkle, not a fold, nothing visible to the naked eye. Rather, it was a stress point, a microscopic ripple of textile resistance that would be entirely unfelt by a hand gliding across the surface, but which, when subjected to the weight and warmth of a sleeping nobleman for hours, would create a subtle, persistent drag. It was a disturbance so minor it bordered on the theoretical, yet potent enough to deny the absolute unblemished freedom of movement that Lord Ashworth, with his delicate sensibilities, so craved. The pillows, too, received a special attention. Usually, Agnes would fluff them with an even, distributive motion, ensuring the down settled into a perfectly balanced cloud. On this night, however, as she plumped the pillow destined for Lord Ashworth's head, she introduced a minute, almost artful displacement of feathers. Instead of distributing them uniformly, she allowed a fraction more to gather just off-center, creating an infinitesimally denser spot, a subtle, barely there lump that would not be immediately obvious but would, over the course of a long night, exert a relentless, localized pressure. It was not a lump that could be easily identified and smoothed away. It was a ghost of a lump, a whisper of a protuberance, designed to elude conscious detection while persistently nagging at the subconscious desire for perfect comfort. The other pillow, intended for decorative purposes and often relegated to the floor by the restless nobleman, was made with Agnes' usual impeccable precision. It would serve as a silent, mocking reminder of the perfection that was quite possible, yet now inexplicably indinate. Lord Ashworth retired to his bedchamber that night with his usual air of self-importance and a fresh catalogue of minor grievances from the dinner table. He undressed with a sigh, dismissed his valet, and approached the bed, expecting the customary embrace of comfort. He stretched out, a large, heavy man accustomed to the finest things, and settled onto the mattress. For a moment all seemed well. The sheets felt crisp, the mattress yielded pleasantly. But as the minutes turned into a quarter of an hour, and then half, a subtle, unidentifiable unease began to creep into his repose. His left leg, no matter how he shifted, felt as though the sheet beneath it clung just a fraction too tightly. A phantom constraint. He would flex his calf, extend his foot, and the sensation would momentarily disappear, only to return with infuriating persistence as he relaxed into sleep. Then there was his head. The pillow, while seemingly soft and yielding, possessed a minute, stubborn firmness just behind his left ear, a density that nudged and teased his skull, preventing that complete, boneless surrender to slumber. He punched the pillow once, twice, vigorously, but the subtle unevenness, a work of artful internal displacement, refused to be tamed. He pulled at the sheet, shifted his weight, turned from one side to the other, muttering under his breath about the damp air, the cook's overly rich stew, or the insidious machinations of his aging body. He would fall asleep, only to wake a short while later, inexplicably restless, the phantom grip of the sheet, or the subtle pressure of the pillow having roused him from anything resembling deep sleep. This pattern continued for several nights, a silent, unacknowledged torment. Each morning, Lord Ashworth descended for breakfast with an increasingly rumpled countenance, his eyes bearing faint, bruised shadows. His usual bluster replaced by a shorter fuse and a tendency to snap at the household staff for the most trivial of infractions. He complained of a general feeling of disquiet, of tossing and turning, of unsettling dreams that he could not recall. He blamed the shifting weather, the rising damp, the peculiar lunar cycle, anything and everything but the perfectly made bed. How could he? The bed, to his eyes, was immaculate. He would often glance at it before leaving the room, seeing only the pristine surfaces Agnes had so skillfully arranged, never suspecting the almost microscopic sabotage that lay beneath. His cerebral capacity, as he had so cuttingly referenced Agnes's own, was entirely incapable of detecting the true source of his discomfort. Agnes, meanwhile, maintained her unreadable composure. Each morning, as she entered Lord Ashworth's bedchamber to begin her duties, she observed him with a quiet, almost scholarly interest. She noted the faint lines of fatigue around his eyes, the slightly pinched look to his mouth, the almost imperceptible tremor in his hand as he lifted his teacup. These were subtle signs, not overt declarations of suffering, but to Agnes they were as clear as a shouted triumph. She knew, with an unwavering certainty, that her carefully placed imperfections were taking root, blooming into a quiet, pervasive misery. She would smooth the sheets, adjusting the tension with a deliberate touch, sometimes removing the minuscule stress point, sometimes reintroducing it in a slightly different location, just enough to keep the nobleman perpetually off balance, never allowing him to pinpoint the source of his agitation. The pillow would be fluffed anew, its subtle imbalance recalibrated, a ghost of a lump in a slightly different quadrant. The irony of the situation was a private source of immense satisfaction for Agnes. The man who had dismissed her craftsmanship, as rudimentary and her intellect as no deeper than a puddle, was now suffering precisely because of her profound skill and meticulous mind. The bed, once a testament to her unblemished service, had become her canvas for a slow, artistic form of psychological warfare. It was a battlefield of linen and feathers, where the weapons were undetectable nuances and the casualties were Lord Ashworth's precious hours of uninterrupted repose. He grew more particular, though less specific, in his daily demands. "The air is too close," he would declare, "or my back aches from a draught." He would complain of restless legs, of a crick in his neck, of a general malaise that seemed to defy explanation. His valet suggested a new mattress, but Lord Ashworth, inspecting the perfectly made bed, scoffed at the idea. "Nonsense! The bed itself is fine. It's this accursed manner. Or perhaps my constitution." Agnes, polishing a brass finial nearby, would hear these pronouncements, her face a serene mask. She understood that the most effective torment was that which could not be identified, could not be blamed on a specific person or object, leaving the victim to conclude that the fault lay within themselves or with the very fabric of their existence. Her long memory, which Lord Ashworth had so carelessly overlooked, was now manifesting itself not as a furious outburst, but as a series of almost imperceptible, yet devastatingly effective, adjustments to his nightly comfort. Each meticulously tucked sheet, each subtly displaced feather, was a silent testament to her resolve, a quiet, ongoing answer to his casual disdain. The nobleman, still oblivious, continued to sleep, or rather not sleep, in the bed of his own making, unaware that the true architect of his nightly unrest was the silent woman who, with a single artful flick of her wrist, could turn a feather pillow into a weapon of quiet, persistent vengeance. The first subtle retaliation had landed, and it was taking root, one restless night at a time. Chapter 4. Sleepless nights begin. The steady, monotonous rhythm of life at Blackwood Manor had begun to acquire a faint, dissonant hum, a subtle shift in its age-old cadence, perceptible mainly to the keenest observers. such as those who dealt with its inhabitants at their most vulnerable in the pale light of morning. Lord Ashworth, once a man whose slumber was as robust and unshakable as his inherited title, found himself increasingly adrift in a sea of broken repose. The initial, subtle adjustments Agnes had made to his bed had proven to be disturbingly effective. What began as a fleeting sense of unease had blossomed into a persistent, bewildering inability to find true comfort, leading him down a rabbit hole of self-diagnosis and escalating frustration. Each morning he awoke not with the customary sense of renewal, but with a weary sigh, his body feeling as though it had spent the night wrestling with an unseen opponent. His eyes, once merely shadowed by age, now bore a faint, bruised quality, and the lines around his mouth seemed to deepen with a perpetual frown. The crisp sheets, which to any other eye appeared perfectly taut and inviting, held within them a secret torment. No matter how he shifted, how he turned, how he punched the pillows into submission, there was always a spot, a phantom tension along his calf, a subtle bunching beneath his shoulder, an almost imperceptible pressure behind his ear. It was never a defined lump, never a distinct wrinkle he could smooth away with a frustrated hand. It was an absence of perfect ease, a whisper of discomfort that clung to him like a damp shroud, preventing the complete blissful surrender to sleep. He would toss and turn, his heavy frame rustling the sheets, the soft creak of the bed frame, a constant companion to his internal monologue of growing exasperation. He would throw an arm over his face, then pull the pillow over his head, then push it away in disgust. The moon, he decided one night, was too bright, its silvery light piercing through the heavy curtains even when they were drawn. Another night he blamed the distant hoot of an owl, then the incessant drip of a leaky gutter somewhere outside, sounds he had never noticed before, yet now amplified to an unbearable crescendo in the stillness of the manor. His dreams, when they came, were fragmented, elusive things, dissolving upon waking into a vague sense of having run a long, pointless race. He would wake, sometimes every hour, sometimes every two, his mind already churning, attempting to pinpoint the source of his elusive discomfort. "It must be this cursed damp," he muttered to himself one particularly gray morning, pushing away a half-eaten slice of toast. The very stones of this house seemed to conspire against a man's rest. His valet, a thin, perpetually worried man named Finch, merely nodded, accustomed to Lord Ashworth's daily litany of complaints. Finch would discreetly add more logs to the fire, ensure the windows were tightly latched, and offer blandishments about the benefits of a good decanter of port before bed, all to no avail. Lord Ashworth's internal narrative of his sleeplessness was a grand dramatic affair, a testament to his ingrained self-importance. It was never the bed, and certainly never the quiet, unassuming servant who made it. How could it be? Agnes's beds, for generations, had been the very epitome of proper comfort. No, it had to be something far more complex, something inherent in his own noble constitution, or perhaps a cosmic alignment of ill fortune. "My humors are out of balance," he declared to Lady Eleonora over a luncheon of surprisingly tough mutton. "Or perhaps it's the weight of my responsibilities. A man of my station, with so much to contend with, naturally carries a heavy burden, even into his sleep." Lady Eleonora, who had her own complaints about the lack of decent imported lace, merely offered a sympathetic, if somewhat distracted, sigh. He began to experiment. One night, he insisted on sleeping without the heavy wool blankets, believing their weight was stifling him. The next, he piled on every available comforter, convinced he was too cold. He changed his sleeping position from his back to his side, then attempted to sleep on his stomach, only to wake with a crick in his neck, and a distinct feeling of having wrestled with a particularly stubborn mattress demon. He tried sleeping with 2 pillows, then with none. He consumed copious amounts of warmed milk, then strong brandy. He even attempted a series of peculiar breathing exercises suggested by an obscure pamphlet on vapors and the nighttime mind that he had found in the library, puffing and sighing like a distressed walrus, much to the quiet amusement of the maids passing his door. Nothing worked. The subtle, unidentifiable discomfort remained, a phantom limb of unease, refusing to be grasped or banished. Agnes, during these weeks of escalating torment, continued her meticulous work. Each morning she entered Lord Ashworth's bedchamber, her face an unblemished mask of calm efficiency. She would observe him from the periphery of her vision, the slight tremble in his hand as he buttered his toast, the sharper edge to his voice when addressing Finch, the almost constant furrowing of his brow, even when contemplating a particularly delightful pastry. And then she would approach the bed. Her fingers, subtle as a breath, would make their daily adjustments. Sometimes she would shift the internal down of the pillow by a fraction of an inch more than the previous day, creating a new, fresh locus of irritation. Other times she would vary the tension of the top sheet. Enduring the almost imperceptible cling was in a different quadrant of the bed. Her art lay not in creating a visible fault, but in creating a weight-shifting fault, a perpetually elusive source of discomfort that prevented the nobleman from ever becoming accustomed to a particular annoyance, thus denying him the ability to identify or dismiss it. It was like a game of whack-a-mole played with his nervous system, each mole appearing in a new, unexpected location, always just out of reach of conscious complaint. The physical manifestations of his sleeplessness began to impact his daily life. His temper grew shorter, his patience thinner. He would bark at the stable boys for imaginary slights, accuse the cook of burning the toast with a vehemence usually reserved for matters of state, and snap at Lady Eleanora for the merest suggestion of an outing. His customary afternoon naps, once a source of deep, restorative rest, became twitchy, unsatisfying affairs, punctuated by sudden starts and mumbled grievances. He grew pale, his complexion acquiring a sallow, unhealthy cast. His once robust appetite waned, replaced by an irritable pickiness. He found himself unable to concentrate on his ledgers, mistaking columns of figures, and his correspondence piled up, awaiting his increasingly fatigued attention. The world, through his sleep-deprived eyes, seemed duller, less vibrant, filled with more irritations and fewer pleasures. He spoke to his physician, a portly man who prescribed tinctures and powders for every conceivable ailment. The physician, after much prodding and a thorough, albeit perfunctory, examination, concluded that Lord Ashworth was suffering from a general constitution of nervous agitation, perhaps exacerbated by the changing seasons and a surfeit of melancholic humors. He recommended a regimen of mild laxatives, warm baths, and a nightly draught of laudanum, which, while inducing a heavy, dreamless state, left Lord Ashworth feeling sluggish and irritable the next morning, robbing him of the very clarity he sought. Lord Ashworth's conviction that the problem lay within himself, or with the uncontrollable forces of nature, solidified. How could it be the bed? It looked perfect. How could it be Agnes? She was always so quiet, so diligent, so unremarkable. The notion was absurd. He was a nobleman. His body, his mind, his very temperament were complex and grand. A simple bed, made by a simple servant, could not possibly be the source of such a profound and persistent disquiet. This belief, born of arrogance and a fundamental inability to see beyond his own elevated perspective, was the very bedrock of his unfolding misery. And Agnes, as she folded his freshly laundered nightshirt with painstaking care each morning, polishing a slight smudge from a silver button, observed his decline with the quiet, unblinking satisfaction of a gardener, watching a particularly slow-growing but utterly exquisite plant unfurl its leaves. The sleepless nights had begun in earnest, not with a bang, but with a series of tiny, perfectly placed disturbances, orchestrated by a mind that Lord Ashworth had so carelessly dismissed as having no deeper cerebral capacity than a puddle. He was, unknowingly, drowning in that puddle. Chapter 5. The servant's secret passed, while Lord Ashworth floundered in the deepening mire of his unidentifiable discomfort, blaming the damp, the moon, and the general decline of the aristocratic constitution. Agnes continued her meticulous work, her quiet precision unwavering. To understand the subtle artistry of her current endeavors, one must peer beyond the dust motes dancing in the Blackwood Manor sunlight, and delve into the forgotten annals of a very peculiar lineage, the lineage from which Agnes sprung. For Agnes was not merely a diligent servant who happened to be exceedingly skilled at her trade. She was the latest in a long, unbroken line of individuals known, in hushed tones and fading dialects, as the feather weavers, or more colloquially amongst themselves, the comfort deniers. Her family, the Calloways, had served the grand houses of the landed gentry for centuries, always in the capacity of principal bedmakers. From the sprawling estates of Northumberland to the cramped, fashionable townhouses of Mayfair, a Calloway had always been present, ensuring the nightly repose of the privileged. But beneath the facade of impeccable service lay a philosophy forged in generations of quiet observation and unspoken slights. The Calloways were not born into their unique craft. They were initiated. It was a tradition passed down not through written ledgers or formal apprenticeship, but through whispered lessons in dimly lit sculleries, through the subtle instruction of hands over a newly laundered sheet, and through the pointed, almost poetic recounting of aristocratic follies. Agnes's grandmother, Elara, a woman whose hands were gnarled as ancient roots, but whose touch on a pillow could shift a single feather with purposeful intent, had been her primary tutor. Elara, with her eyes like polished pebbles and a memory sharper than a freshly honed needle, had taught Agnes the true meaning of their family motto, etched not on a coat of arms, but into the very consciousness of every Calloway bedmaker: sleep is a privilege. This was not a cynical pronouncement, nor a bitter one, but a fundamental truth. To the Calloways, comfort was not an inherent right of birth, but a delicate balance, easily disturbed, meticulously crafted, and most importantly, bestowed. And if it could be bestowed, it could also be, with equal precision, subtly withheld. The Calloway method was rooted in an exhaustive understanding of textiles, gravity, human physiology, and, perhaps most crucially, the delicate psychology of the entitled. They learned to identify the precise weave of every linen, the specific give of every down feather, the subtle differences in human weight distribution, and the maddening effects of an almost imperceptible irregularity. Agnes remembered long evenings, sitting by the hearth, watching Elara demonstrate the slight shift of the left hip, a technique for creating a minute tension in the bottom sheet that would cause a sleeper's hip to subtly, almost imperceptibly, drag against the fabric, preventing the complete release of muscle tension. Elara would then explain the ghost of a knot, where a single thread, twisted just so, could create a pressure point on the smallest toe, too minor to fully wake, but too persistent to allow deep slumber. These were not methods born of malicious intent in the common sense, but of a profound, generational understanding of ironic justice. For centuries, the Calloways had been the silent witnesses to the petty cruelties, the casual dismissals, and the towering arrogance of those they served. They saw their quiet dignity trampled, their meticulous work overlooked, and their very humanity rendered invisible. And so, they developed their unique form of quiet rectification. To insult a Calloway bedmaker was not to invite an immediate, obvious retribution, but to enroll oneself in a slow, exquisitely tailored course of nocturnal inconvenience. Elara had recounted tales of her own grandmother, a woman named Bess, who had served a particularly boisterous baron known for his habit of loudly declaring his sheets to be replete with the sweat of ill-bred peasants. Bess, in response, had perfected the whisper of sand, a method of introducing a handful of finely sifted, near-invisible silica into the lowest layer of the mattress, ticking, creating a microscopic, inescapable grit that would abrade the skin over time, yet be utterly undetectable upon inspection. The Baron, Bess reported, had suffered from a peculiar persistent rash for months, convinced it was a curse or a malady of the humors, never once suspecting the impeccable cleanliness of his bedding. Another tale involved Agnes's great-uncle, Thomas, a man who served a marquis obsessed with the perfect plumpness of his pillows. The marquis, a man of considerable girth, would routinely berate Thomas for pillows he deemed too thin or too firm. Thomas, a meticulous craftsman, eventually developed the elastic sigh, a method of subtly stitching a nearly invisible elastic thread into the innermost casing of the pillow, creating a very slight but persistent internal tension that would cause the pillow to resist the natural flattening of a head, pushing back with an almost imperceptible pressure that prevented true restful surrender. The Marquis, Ilara explained, had spent his twilight years complaining of chronic neck stiffness, convinced he had slept on a permanent draft. These were not acts of petty vindictiveness. To the Callaways, they were acts of rebalancing. They were the invisible scales of justice, weighed with the precision of a master clockmaker. Their motto, "Sleep is a privilege," underscored their belief that comfort, true, unblemished comfort, was a gift to be earned, or at the very least, not to be taken for granted, and certainly not to be dismissed with casual disdain. When Lord Ashworth, in his self-important bluster, had declared Agnes's bed-making rudimentary and her intellect no deeper than a puddle, he had not merely insulted her. He had challenged the very foundation of the Callaway heritage. He had asserted his right to a privilege he clearly did not appreciate, and in doing so had opened himself to the meticulous generational art of its subtle withdrawal. Agnes had absorbed these lessons not as a burden, but as a calling. She understood the weight of her heritage. Her quiet demeanor was not subservience, but a mask of profound focus, a disciplined suppression of any outward emotion that might betray the internal calculations. Her long memory, which Lord Ashworth had so carelessly overlooked, was not just for personal slights. It was for the collective slights of her ancestors, for every whispered indignity, every casual cruelty inflicted upon the invisible hands that served. She carried the mantle of the comfort deniers with the solemnity of a priestess performing a sacred ritual. Each night, as she approached Lord Ashworth's bed, her movements were imbued with generations of quiet knowledge. The imperceptible unevenness of the sheets, the ghost of a lump in the pillow, these were not random acts of sabotage. They were precisely calibrated applications of the Callaway techniques, honed over centuries, designed to chip away at the nobleman's repose without ever leaving a discernible trace. She was not angry in the conventional sense. Rather, she was executing a deeply ingrained family tradition, a quiet, almost meditative act of precise, ironic rebalancing. The bed, that seemingly innocuous piece of furniture, was not just a place to sleep. It was the ultimate canvas for the Callaway art, a silent testament to the enduring power of the unseen, the unacknowledged, and the quietly vengeful. Lord Ashworth, in his increasingly fragmented slumber, was now directly experiencing the living embodiment of the Callaway motto, a truth whispered across centuries through hands that served but never forgot. Sleep, a privilege, and for some, a privilege to be very carefully and very slowly revoked. Chapter 6. The nobleman's growing paranoia, the relentless tide of sleeplessness, had, by now, carved deep ravines into Lord Ashworth's once ruddy countenance. His complexion, once robustly florid, had faded to a mottled, sallow hue, and his eyes, perpetually bloodshot, seemed to recede further into their sockets, ringed by bruised, purplish shadows that bespoke an endless internal battle. The subtle discomforts that Agnes so meticulously wove into his nightly repose had done their work with chilling efficiency. What had begun as mere restlessness had metastasized into a pervasive, gnawing exhaustion, manifesting as a frayed temper, a profound inability to concentrate, and, most alarmingly, a creeping, insidious paranoia. He still complained of the damp, of the peculiar chill that seemed to cling to his bedchamber despite roaring fires, and of the unidentifiable draughts that whispered through the ancient stone. But these explanations, once sufficient, now seemed woefully inadequate to encompass the depth of his nightly torment. The bed, while always appearing perfectly made by Agnes, its sheets crisp, its pillows plump, its blankets neatly folded, continued to be a source of bewildering unease. He would inspect it himself each night, running a hand over the taut linen, prodding the resilient mattress, but found nothing. Yet, the moment he settled into it, the phantom tension, the ghost of a lump, the indefinable wrongness would return, clinging to him like a persistent, unseen shroud. His sleep, when it came, was a series of brief, agitated naps, punctuated by sudden, startled awakenings. He would jolt awake, heart pounding, convinced he had just experienced a profound disturbance, only to find the room silent, the moonlight streaming through the window, and the source of his terror utterly intangible. He began to believe the very air in his room was somehow wrong, that the dust motes danced with a malicious intent, that the shadows held watching eyes. He would sometimes pull his heavy curtains closed with a furious yank, convinced that the moon itself was mocking his torment with its placid, unblinking stare. His family physician, Dr. Alistair Finchley, a man whose medical knowledge was largely comprised of inherited superstitions and copious bleedings, had become a daily fixture at Blackwood Manor. Finchley, whose previous diagnoses had ranged from excess of black bile to a general constitutional melancholia, now found himself increasingly baffled by Lord Ashworth's peculiar symptoms. The nobleman presented no fever, no discernible ailment, no physical malady that could be readily cured with leeches or purging draughts. Yet his decline was undeniable. My Lord Dr. Finchley would declare, peering through his spectacles at Lord Ashworth's increasingly pallid face, "It appears your humours are in a state of unprecedented disarray. I detect a curious agitation of the vital spirits, a profound resistance to natural repose. Have you perhaps offended a particularly powerful sprite of the hearth? Or perhaps inadvertently stepped upon a fey ring in the meadow?" Finchley, driven to the fringes of his limited medical understanding, began to dabble in the more esoteric explanations for his patient's affliction. He prescribed a variety of increasingly bizarre remedies, poultices of dried toad skins applied to the forehead, nightly fumigations with burnt rosemary and rue, and a particularly vile-tasting tonic made from powdered moonstones and bat guano. Each morning Lord Ashworth would complain of increased restlessness, of a burning sensation on his skin, or of a distinctly bat-like aftertaste in his mouth, but never of any improvement. Agnes, ever the silent observer, would occasionally bring in a fresh linen while Dr. Finchley, draped in a cloud of acrid smoke from his herbal burners, performed a ritualistic dance around Lord Ashworth's bed, chanting incantations to banish malevolent spirits. Her face, as always, betrayed nothing. She would simply set down the clean towels, her eyes discreetly taking in Lord Ashworth's haggard appearance, and Finchley's increasingly frantic gesticulations, a faint internal hum of satisfaction resonating deep within her. The absurdity of the scene was a quiet victory, a confirmation of the cunning simplicity of her methods. As the physician's remedies proved useless, Lord Ashworth's belief in a mundane explanation withered, replaced by a terrifying conviction that his sleeplessness was not a malady, but a malevolent curse. "It is a hex, Finchley," he proclaimed one morning, his voice raw with exhaustion and a new, desperate edge. "A curse laid upon me by some unseen hand. How else to explain this constant torment? My bed, though seemingly perfect, holds me hostage. My mind, though weary, refuses to yield to true sleep. It is an affliction of the spirit. a dark magic woven into the very fabric of my nights. Driven by this new certainty, he began to consult others, less savory individuals than the bumbling Finchley. He sent for old women from the villages known for their knowledge of charms and counter-charms, though they invariably offered only useless amulets and mumbled superstition. Then came the alchemists, men with dark, glittering eyes and fingers stained with obscure compounds, who promised to distill the very essence of slumber into a potent elixir, or to transmute his restlessness into golden tranquility. One such alchemist, a thin, intensely serious man named Master Silas Grimshaw, arrived at Blackwood Manor with an entourage of apprentices and a portable laboratory of bubbling retorts and smoking crucibles. Grimshaw, whose reputation was built more on theatricality than actual results, conducted elaborate rituals in Lord Ashworth's bedchamber. He burned strange-smelling resins, drew intricate chalk circles on the floor, and, most memorably, produced a glass sphere filled with what he claimed was congealed moonlight, which he placed under Lord Ashworth's pillow. "This, my lord," Grimshaw intoned dramatically, his voice a low, resonant rumble, "will draw out the nocturnal vapors that disturb your spirit and restore the sacred equilibrium of your slumber." He then charged Lord Ashworth a king's ransom for the moon sphere and its accompanying incantations. Lord Ashworth, desperate, held on to a sliver of hope. He lay in bed that night, the congealed moonlight cold and hard beneath his pillow, willing it to work. But the phantom drag of the sheet, the subtle shift in the pillow's density remained. He twisted, he turned, he muttered, the glass sphere digging into his skull with increasing irritation. By morning he was more exhausted, more agitated, and infinitely more convinced that the curse was potent indeed, resisting even the most powerful of counterspells. The moon sphere was hurled across the room in a fit of pique, shattering against the far wall. His paranoia deepened. He began to suspect the servants, then his family members. Were they perhaps in league with the curse? Was one of them secretly poisoning his tea, whispering enchantments into his very chamber walls? He would wake in the dead of night, his heart hammering, listening intently for footsteps outside his door, for the creak of a floorboard. Convinced he was being watched, subtly sabotaged, he paced his room for hours, convinced that if he could just stay awake, he could outwit the curse, outrun the malevolence that pursued his repose. But the exhaustion, a heavy, suffocating blanket, would eventually pull him down, only for the cycle of restless, unfulfilling sleep to begin anew. Agnes, meanwhile, remained his unwavering, unreadable bedmaker. Each day, she collected the linen, smoothing away the evidence of his tormented nights. She observed the fresh scratches on his polished mahogany bedside table where he had dragged objects in his fitful sleep. She noted the increasing tremor in his hands when he reached for his brandy glass, the dullness of his eyes, the almost constant flinch that punctuated his movements. She heard his increasingly frantic calls for Finchley, for Grimshaw, for any charlatan who offered a glimmer of hope. And each night, with a subtle, almost artistic adjustment, a fraction of a degree in tension here, a minute displacement of down there, she ensured that the curse, as Lord Ashworth now perceived it, continued its quiet, relentless work. She knew with the calm certainty of a master craftswoman that the true sorcery lay not in burnt herbs or congealed moonlight, but in the precise unyielding application of the Callaway motto, "Sleep was a privilege." And for Lord Ashworth, it was a privilege being very, very carefully and very verily revoked. His torment was entirely self-inflicted, a masterpiece of quiet vengeance woven into the very threads of his own luxurious, yet now deeply unsettling, unsettling bed. He was, in his profound and escalating paranoia, the unwitting victim of his own careless words. A man truly sleeping in the bed he had made, stitch by agonizing stitch. Chapter 7. The Art of Bed-Making Warfare. The stately facade of Blackwood Manor continued its slow, stately decline. a process entirely unnoticed by Lord Ashworth, who was by now far too consumed by his own escalating torment. The subtle ministrations of Agnes, those carefully calibrated imperfections, had successfully eroded his once robust slumber, replacing it with a frayed, fractured state of near constant agitation. His once florid face now wore the permanent hue of stale parchment, and his eyes, perpetually bloodshot and sunken, darted about with a haunted, suspicious intensity. His complaints, once merely irritable grumbles, had taken on a desperate, frantic edge, echoing through the halls like the cries of a man, convinced he was wrestling with phantoms. The phantom tensions, the ghost of a lump, the indefinable cling of the sheets, these had achieved their initial purpose, convincing Lord Ashworth that his affliction was an internal one, a curse, a malady of the humors, or a general constitutional failing. But Agnes, in her quiet wisdom and adherence to the ancient Callaway tradition, knew that torment, like any finely crafted art, demanded escalation. The casual dismissal of her cerebral capacity, the cutting words about her bed-making being rudimentary and not fit for a pig, echoed with a particular clarity in Agnes's mind. Such pronouncements, born of sheer arrogance, had settled not as a wound but as a catalyst. The time for mere elusive discomfort was past. Now, the battleground of the bed would become a sensory minefield, meticulously sown with irritations that were just as elusive, but undeniably more direct in their unpleasantness. Agnes, in her meticulous preparation, approached the task with the focused intensity of a master strategist. Her first innovation, a refinement of the whisper of sand taught by her grandmother Ilara, involved the strategic placement of what she internally referred to as sleep burrs. These were not the coarse, readily identifiable burrs from the fields, which would be far too obvious for her refined method. Instead, Agnes utilized the knowledge gleaned from centuries of Callaway ingenuity, a knowledge passed down through whispered secrets and guarded recipes. She prepared a mixture of finely crushed, dried thistle fibers, almost microscopic in size, combined with the equally minute barbed hairs from certain lesser-known varieties of stinging nettle. This concoction, once desiccated and sifted through the finest of silk sieves, resembled nothing more than a faint, innocuous dust. But when applied with precision, it possessed a truly remarkable capacity for insidious irritation. Each evening, as Agnes meticulously made Lord Ashworth's bed, her hands moved with their customary grace, yet with a renewed sense of purpose. She would take a small, almost imperceptible pinch of this irritating dust and, with a subtle flick of her wrist, sprinkle it between the layers of the top sheet and the heavier wool blanket, particularly along the length where Lord Ashworth's legs and torso would most frequently rest. These tiny barbed fibers, invisible to the naked eye, would not cause an immediate sting or an obvious rash. Instead, as the body's warmth and the friction of movement worked upon them throughout the night, they would migrate and subtly prickle the skin, creating a sensation that was maddeningly persistent, yet utterly untraceable. It was an itch without a visible source, a crawling sensation that shifted and teased, preventing any true surrender to deep sleep. Sometimes, she would apply a faint dusting to the seams of the pillowcases, ensuring that the slightest shift of Lord Ashworth's head would dislodge a fresh wave of microscopic irritants, sending a ghost of a prickle across his scalp or the sensitive skin behind his ears. Then there were the feathers, once the epitome of Agnes's perfectly balanced comfort, now transformed into instruments of subtle torment. She had long mastered the art of evenly distributing down, creating a cloud-like consistency. Now, she employed the precise opposite. Agnes began to select specific goose quills from the feather stores, those with the slightest bend or a particularly resilient shaft. Instead of ensuring their softest, fluffiest part presented itself to the sleeper, she would subtly reorient them, positioning their firmer, sharper tips just beneath the surface of the pillow, angled precisely to prod a sensitive pressure point, the soft hollow behind the ear, the delicate curve of the neck or the sensitive skin of the temple. These were not sharp enough to pierce the skin, but just firm enough to create a persistent, localized pressure, a feeling like a small, stubborn pebble, or a single, stray hair that could never quite be brushed away. She would also strategically embed a few longer, stiffer feathers into the mattress, ticking itself, just beneath the uppermost layer of down, ensuring that no matter how Lord Ashworth shifted, there was always a chance of a recalcitrant quill poking or tickling his back or hips in an entirely new, maddening spot. The beauty of it, in Agnes's quiet estimation, was that these imperfections were entirely internal to the bedding, defying all attempts at external inspection. Lord Ashworth's nights, already a fractured landscape of tossing and turning, now descended into a purgatory of relentless phantom discomfort. He would lie in his grand bed, surrounded by the finest silks and linens, yet feel as though he were sleeping in a bed of thorns. The insidious itching would begin, a subtle prickle that spread across his skin, particularly his legs and back, a sensation that drove him to frantic scratching. He would claw at his sheets, convinced that invisible fleas or mites had infested his bed, despite the meticulous cleanliness maintained by Agnes. He would throw back the blankets, illuminate the room with his bedside lamp, and peer desperately at the pristine linen, searching for any sign of the tormentors. Of course, he would find nothing. The sheets were immaculate, the blankets unblemished. He would then blame the air, the dust, the very threads of the linen, convinced they were imbued with some cursed, irritating quality. The feather pokes were equally maddening. He would shift his head, trying to find a comfortable spot, only for a subtle, unyielding pressure to appear elsewhere. It felt like a constant, localized nudge, a persistent prod that kept his mind in a state of hyper-awareness, unable to relax into the deep oblivion of sleep. He would punch the pillows, reshape them with furious hands, but the strategically placed quills would simply reorient themselves, ready to resume their quiet assault. His dreams, when they came, were vivid, unpleasant affairs, filled with crawling insects and unseen hands, from which he would wake with a choked cry, covered in a cold sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs. By morning, Lord Ashworth was a wreck. His eyes were perpetually bloodshot, rimmed with purple, and his skin, particularly on his arms and legs, showed faint red marks where he had scratched himself raw in his sleep. His temper, already volatile, became truly explosive, triggered by the slightest provocation. He screamed at Finch for a wrinkled cravat, accused the kitchen staff of poisoning his porridge, and glared at Lady Eleanora as if she were personally responsible for his nocturnal torments. He lost weight, his appetite almost entirely gone, replaced by a constant nervous energy. His hands trembled so violently that he often spilled his morning tea, and his once booming voice had acquired a high-pitched, almost reedy quality. His growing paranoia reached new heights. He barred his bedchamber door at night, convinced someone was sneaking in to tamper with his bed. He would frequently awaken and inspect his room, holding a flickering candle aloft, searching for hidden implements or strange sigils. He would strip his bed himself, scattering the perfectly clean sheets and blankets, then stand over them, prodding and tearing at the fabric in a desperate search for the source of his misery, only to collapse back into the bed, defeated and more exhausted than before. He consulted more quacks, more charlatans, even a self-proclaimed dream interpreter who claimed his nocturnal suffering was the direct result of an imbalance of planetary influences during his birth. Each new remedy, each absurd ritual, only served to deepen his conviction that he was under a profound, unshakable curse, a malevolent force targeting his very rest. Agnes, meanwhile, observed the decline with the unblinking gaze of a sculptor, watching their masterpiece take shape. Each morning, as she gathered the disheveled bed linen, Lord Ashworth often flung it onto the floor in a fit of pique. She would note the fresh scratch marks on his skin, the telltale signs of restless, irritated sleep. She would carefully smooth the sheets, replump the pillows, her fingers moving with surgical precision as she re-established or subtly altered the arrangement of the thistle fibers and the prodding quills. She was not driven by anger. Not truly. Instead, it was a profound, quiet satisfaction, a deep appreciation for the artistry of her ancestors, who had perfected this delicate dance of discomfort over centuries. The irony was not lost on her. The nobleman who had so carelessly dismissed her intellect, who had deemed her rudimentary and not fit for a pig, was now experiencing the meticulous cerebral application of her deepest family secrets. His luxurious bed, a symbol of his privilege, had become his personal torture chamber, an exquisite, invisible prison of his own making. Agnes saw not a man suffering from an unknown malady, but a man experiencing the very tangible consequences of his own arrogance. A man whose privilege of sleep was being slowly, agonizingly, and irrevocably revoked, one microscopic burr and strategically placed feather at a time. The art of bed-making warfare, honed by generations of Callaways, was now in full, silent bloom, and Lord Ashworth was its primary, unwitting recipient, scratching his way through nights that promised no peace. Chapter 8. A Courtly Conspiracy. The labyrinthine corridors of Blackwood Manor, once echoing with the measured footsteps of tradition, now seemed to vibrate with an almost palpable tension, a peculiar hum that emanated directly from the increasingly frayed nerves of Lord Ashworth. His sleepless nights, a meticulously crafted torment woven by Agnes and the ancient Callaway methods, had transformed him from a merely irritable nobleman into a man teetering on the precipice of full-blown delusion. His once booming voice now cracked with fatigue, his hands trembled with a perpetual palsy, and his eyes, deep-set and bloodshot, held a wild, suspicious glint that cast a pall over the entire household. He continued to blame the damp, the moon, the peculiar humors of his own constitution, and, increasingly, an invisible malevolent curse that had taken root in his bedchamber. The quacks and charlatans he consulted had only served to deepen his conviction, providing no tangible relief, only more bizarre remedies and exorbitant fees. Yet, as Lord Ashworth spiraled deeper into his self-made purgatory, a curious phenomenon began to unfold within the servants' quarters, a quiet, unspoken understanding that rippled through the hierarchical structure of the manor's unseen workforce. For generations, the household staff of Blackwood Manor, like their counterparts in grand houses across the land, had endured the casual cruelties, the thoughtless dismissals, and the arbitrary temperaments of their masters. Lord Ashworth, in particular, with his bluster and his cutting remarks about their competence, had accumulated a formidable ledger of slights in the collective memory of his staff, a silent counterpoint to Agnes's own meticulously catalogued grievances. They saw his decline. Of course. They witnessed his bloodshot eyes, his trembling hands, his increasingly irrational outbursts. And they saw, too, the precise and unreadable face of Agnes as she moved through his chamber each morning, tidying the disheveled evidence of his restless nights. It began subtly with the cook. Cook Griselda, a woman of formidable girth and an even more formidable temper, had endured Lord Ashworth's endless complaints about her stews, her roasts, and her seemingly infinite capacity to displease his delicate palate. He had only a week prior declared her renowned partridge pie to be a travesty of avian flesh, fit only for the scullery dogs, and even they would turn up their noses. Griselda had merely bowed, her face impassive, but a slow, volcanic resentment had begun to bubble within her. Now, as she prepared Lord Ashworth's evening meal, a rich, undeniably fatty venison stew, she added a generous, almost imperceptible extra pinch of the dried powdered root of a certain local herb, known in hushed village lore for its peculiar ability to induce a mild, yet persistent, gastric unease without causing overt illness. It was not enough to make him truly sick, merely enough to ensure a churning in his gut that would, combined with his already fragile state, contribute to a restless, uncomfortable night. Lord Ashworth, oblivious, consumed the stew with his usual complaints about its seasoning, never suspecting the quiet culinary revenge simmering within. Next came Finch, the valet. Poor Finch, who suffered daily under the lash of Lord Ashworth's fatigued frustrations. He had been berated for wrinkled cravats, for ill-polished boots, for failing to anticipate his master's every fickle whim. Most recently, Lord Ashworth had sneered at Finch's lack of dexterity, declaring his morning shave to be akin to being attacked by a badger. Finch, a timid man by nature, would merely wring his hands and stammer apologies. But an idea, a small, delightful spark, had ignited in his quiet mind. Now, as he laid out Lord Ashworth's nightly raiment, he would subtly twist a loose thread on the silk nightshirt, just enough to create a barely perceptible rough spot that would chafe against the skin over hours. Or he would, with the utmost care, ensure that the drawstring of the nightcap was tied with an almost imperceptible tightness, causing a slight pressure on Lord Ashworth's scalp throughout the night, just enough to be irritating, but not enough to be easily loosened in his half-asleep fumbling. He even took to pressing a particularly stiff, poorly laundered handkerchief into Lord Ashworth's hand at bedtime, ensuring the crisp, unyielding fabric would brush uncomfortably against his face as he tossed and turned. Finch found a quiet, almost giddy satisfaction in these minute acts of defiance, a sensation far more potent than any shouted protest. The laundress, a stern-faced woman named Mary, who had been subjected to Lord Ashworth's endless complaints about the crispness of his linen. He once claimed a perfectly starched shirt felt like a damp sackcloth against his noble flesh, joined the silent conspiracy. When Lord Ashworth's freshly laundered sheets and nightshirts came through her domain, Mary, whose hands were as skilled with fabric as Agnes's were with beds, would subtly rinse them in water that was a fraction too cool, or with a hint less softener than usual. The result was fabric that, while visibly clean and pressed, possessed a minute, almost imperceptible stiffness, a less yielding quality that would prevent the absolute silken embrace of truly comfortable linen. It was a tactile form of protest, a quiet refusal to grant him the full indulgence of comfort he so casually demanded yet never appreciated. Even the stable-boy, young Thomas, who had borne the brunt of Lord Ashworth's increasingly violent rages over trivial matters concerning his horses, found a way to contribute. Lord Ashworth enjoyed a late afternoon ride to clear his head, a ritual he found increasingly irritating due to his persistent fatigue. Thomas, when saddling Lord Ashworth's favorite mare, would ensure the saddle was adjusted by a minute degree, a fraction off-center, or that the stirrups were set just slightly unevenly. The nobleman, already restless and irritable, would find his rides subtly jarring, his body subtly unbalanced, adding to his pervasive sense of discomfort, and feeding his growing suspicion that even his horse was somehow conspiring against him. He would dismount with a furious groan, blaming the horse's unsteady gait or the saddle's infernal design. Agnes, a quiet conductor of this unfolding symphony of discomfort, observed these developments with a deep internal satisfaction. She didn't orchestrate their individual actions. Rather, she perceived that her initial meticulously applied discomforts had created a fertile ground for a shared, unspoken resentment to blossom. The other servants, seeing Lord Ashworth's increasingly pronounced distress, and perhaps subconsciously sensing the source lay beyond mere illness, began to contribute their own unique talents to the nobleman's mounting misery. There was no need for words, no need for overt planning. It was a shared understanding, a collective sigh of exasperation against the burden of entitlement that manifested in these small, precise acts of domestic sabotage. Lord Ashworth, of course, remained utterly oblivious to the silent conspiracy brewing beneath his very roof. His paranoia, already flourishing, now found new targets for its frantic accusations. He complained that his food was unaccountably heavy, that his clothes felt strangely irritating, and that his very horse seemed to delight in jostling his fragile constitution. He attributed these new discomforts not to the actions of his put-upon staff, but to the multifaceted nature of the curse he was convinced had descended upon him. "It spreads, Finchley," he shrieked at his bewildered physician one morning, his face contorted with a grotesque mixture of fear and exhaustion. "The curse is not confined to my bed. It infects my very raiment, my sustenance, even the beast I ride. It is an insidious, pervasive malediction, attacking every aspect of my repose." Dr. Finchley. Dr. Finchley, whose repertoire of treatments had long been exhausted, simply wrung his hands and suggested a stronger dose of laudanum, which Lord Ashworth, in his desperation, consumed with increasing frequency, only to wake from heavy, dreamless sleep, feeling more disoriented and agitated than before. The alchemist, Master Silas Grimshaw, now frequently summoned to perform elaborate purification rituals in the manor's dining hall, solemnly nodded his head, muttering about etheric contaminations and residual negative energies that clung to the nobleman's belongings. He offered Lord Ashworth increasingly expensive talismans and crystalline remedies, each as useless as the last. The servants, observing these increasingly absurd scenes, struggled to maintain their masks of deference. A shared, almost imperceptible smirk would pass between cook Griselda and Mary, the laundress, as Lord Ashworth declared his breakfast porridge to be chock full of ill-wishing crumbs. Young Thomas would often wipe a hand across his mouth to conceal a grin as Lord Ashworth railed at his mare for a phantom stumble during their ride. And Finch, the valet, despite his perpetual worry, found a quiet, almost wicked pleasure in the subtle strategic placement of a new, barely detectable roughness on his master's freshly pressed nightshirt. Agnes, the true maestro of this quiet symphony of discomfort, moved through it all with unwavering serenity. Her daily routine remained unchanged, her movements precise, her face unreadable. She continued to weave her own particular brand of disquiet into Lord Ashworth's bed. The shifting feather, the phantom sheet tension, the almost invisible burrs. But she also observed, with a deep internal appreciation, the contributions of her fellow sufferers. She noted the slight, telltale grimace on Lord Ashworth's face after a meal, the way he would subtly adjust his collar or tug at his nightshirt, the irritable way he would dismount his horse. These were all small, silent confirmations that the courtly conspiracy, born of collective grievances and fueled by his growing paranoia, was flourishing. Lord Ashworth, in his arrogance, had dismissed them all as simple, unthinking drones. Now, those same drones were, with quiet, unshakable solidarity, meticulously dismantling his comfort, stitch by invisible stitch, one sleepless night and uncomfortable day at a time. The nobleman, still convinced he battled a cosmic curse, was in fact locked in a war against his own household, a battle he was losing precisely because he could not, and would not ever truly see his adversaries. Chapter 9. The Nobleman's Public Humiliation. The chill of an impending autumn had begun to assert itself in the manor, seeping through the stone and whispering around the heavy tapestries. Yet the interior of Blackwood Manor felt warmer, almost feverish with the peculiar tension that now permeated its very air. Lord Ashworth, once a figure of grand, if boorish authority, had become a walking testament to the ravages of persistent, inexplicable discomfort. His face was a landscape of haunted weariness, his skin a parchment stretched taut over brittle bones, and his eyes, once merely bloodshot, now seemed to hold the frantic, unfocused gaze of a cornered beast. The phantom prickles, the elusive lumps, the subtle cling of the sheets, combined with the mild gastric unease from cook Griselda's artfully seasoned stews, the chafing of Finch's meticulously flawed nightshirts, and the jarring rides orchestrated by young Thomas, had chipped away at his once robust constitution with the relentless patience of a glacier. His days were a blur of irritation and an overwhelming desire for the deep restorative sleep that stubbornly eluded him, while his nights were a tortured cycle of tossing, turning, and frantic, futile searches for invisible tormentors. His paranoia had swollen to monstrous proportions. He saw malice in every shadow, conspiracy in every whisper. His once firm belief in a cosmic curse had solidified into a terrifying certainty, encompassing not just his bed, but his very raiment, his sustenance, and indeed his entire existence. He had, with increasing frequency, found himself speaking aloud to unseen entities, admonishing them for their malevolent influence, convinced that some unseen force was actively plotting his ruin. His physician, Dr. Finchley, now resembled a wilting daisy, his meager medical knowledge utterly exhausted, reduced to recommending increasingly potent doses of laudanum, which merely rendered Lord Ashworth sluggish and disoriented, rather than truly rested. The alchemist, Master Grimshaw, had long since abandoned the pretense of healing, now simply offering increasingly esoteric talismans and bizarre incantations in exchange for ever larger sums, capitalizing on the nobleman's spiraling desperation. Agnes, meanwhile, moved through this increasing chaos with the unhurried grace of a seasoned hunter. Her face remained a placid, unreadable canvas, her movements precise, her duties performed with unblemished perfection. Each morning, as she tidied Lord Ashworth's bedchamber, she observed the deepening circles under his eyes, the faint scratches on his skin from his fitful scratching, the way his jaw seemed perpetually clenched. She would smooth the sheets he had so frantically disarranged, refluff the pillows he had beaten into submission, and with each precise movement she would subtly, expertly reintroduce the elements of discomfort, sometimes shifting their placement, sometimes altering their intensity, ensuring that his nervous system never quite adapted, never found a stable point of repose. She was not inflicting pain, not truly. She was simply denying the privilege. One invisible thread, one misplaced feather, one infinitesimal shift in texture at a time. The occasion for the nobleman's most spectacular unraveling was a grand banquet, a necessity of social standing, and an opportunity for Lord Ashworth to impress a visiting dignitary, the notoriously humorless Baron von Richter, from a distant, strategically important principality. Lady Eleonora had spent weeks meticulously planning the event, agonizing over every detail, from the imported silks for the table settings to the precise vintage of the wines. Lord Ashworth, despite his profound exhaustion, felt compelled to rise to the occasion, to project an image of unassailable vigor and prosperity, lest his current malaise be interpreted as weakness, or worse, a sign of impending financial ruin. The night of the banquet arrived. A hoarse symphony of glittering candelabras, clinking crystal, and the murmur of polite, if strained, conversation. The great hall of Blackwood Manor, usually shrouded in a perpetual gloom, was ablaze with light and the scent of roast pheasant and expensive perfume. Lord Ashworth, clad in his finest velvet doublet, his powdered wig meticulously arranged to conceal the thinning hair beneath, forced a rictus of a smile onto his pallid face. He greeted his guests with a stiff bow, his hand trembling imperceptibly as he accepted their well wishes. He felt as though every nerve ending in his body was singing a high-pitched discordant note, his exhaustion a tangible weight pressing down on his skull. He had managed only a few hours of fitful sleep the previous night, plagued by an insidious combination of phantom itching and the distinct feeling of being constantly nudged by something unidentifiable beneath his left hip. The banquet proceeded with the stilted formality of such occasions. Course after course was presented, each one a testament to cook Griselda's deliberate, gut-churning artistry for Lord Ashworth. He picked at his food, his appetite long since vanished, and forced himself to engage in conversation, his voice often trailing off mid-sentence as his mind struggled to maintain focus. Lady Eleonora, seated beside him, frequently nudged him with her elbow, her smile fixed but her eyes conveying a desperate plea for him to maintain his composure. As the evening wore on, and the wine flowed freely for the guests, though Lord Ashworth cautiously sipped watered-down spirits, fearing further digestive upset, the air in the hall grew thick with warmth and the drowsy hum of satisfied consumption. Lord Ashworth's eyelids felt heavy, weighted with lead. He blinked, he pinched himself under the table, he even tried to discreetly jab his leg with a fork, anything to ward off the encroaching oblivion. But the cumulative effect of weeks of sleep deprivation, coupled with the subtle, pervasive discomforts inflicted by his household, was now an overwhelming force. Finally, after the main courses had been cleared and the port was circulating, Lord Ashworth rose to deliver his customary speech. It was a tedious affair, typically a rambling discourse on the declining moral fiber of the younger generation, interspersed with self-congratulatory remarks about his own sagacity and the enduring glory of the Ashworth line. He stood at the head of the polished oak table, his goblet clutched in a trembling hand, the candlelight glinting off the elaborate embroidery of his doublet. He began, his voice surprisingly robust at first, fueled by a last surge of adrenaline. Esteemed Baron von Richter, noble lords and ladies, and distinguished guests. He paused for dramatic effect, his eyes scanning the faces before him, a sea of polite, expectant expressions. He continued, stumbling slightly over a word, then correcting himself. It is with profound satisfaction that I extend to you all the warmest of welcomes to Blackwood Manor. A manor, I might add, that has stood for centuries, a bastion of tradition, a testament to enduring strength in these restless times. His voice began to acquire a peculiar slurred quality. His eyes, fixed on a point just beyond Baron von Richter's impassive face, started to lose their focus. A ripple of unease passed through the assembled guests. Lady Eleonora's hand flew to her mouth. The Baron von Richter raised a quizzical eyebrow. Lord Ashworth swayed, almost imperceptibly, his body an unwilling pendulum. He cleared his throat, a wet, rattling sound. Indeed, these are times of great perturbation. A man's repose, once a bastion of peace, now seems to be beset by forces unseen, by humors, by. His head began to slowly, inexorably, droop. The words faded into an inchoate murmur, a soft, gutturous sound that resembled nothing so much as a contented snore. His grip on the goblet loosened. His eyes closed, then fluttered open briefly, showing only the whites, before sliding shut once more. And then, with a soft, almost graceful collapse, Lord Ashworth, the once arrogant nobleman, head of the Ashworth line, slumped forward. His wig, dislodged by the sudden motion, slipped sideways, revealing a patch of slick, pale scalp. His forehead came to rest directly in a half-eaten custard tart, squishing the delicate pastry with a wet, final sigh. A faint, almost delicate snore emanated from the midst of the sugary mess, punctuated by a soft, gurgling sound as he inhaled a microscopic piece of crust. A gasp rippled through the hall, followed by a shocked, incredulous silence. Lady Eleonora let out a small, strangled cry. Finch, the valet, rushed forward, his face a mask of horrified embarrassment. Cook Griselda, peering from the kitchen doorway, merely adjusted her apron, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. Mary the laundress, assisting with the removal of plates, exchanged a quick, knowing glance with young Thomas, who was attempting to stifle a giggle behind a gloved hand. But it was Agnes, standing quietly in the shadows near the entrance to the servants' passage, who observed the scene with a profound, almost artistic satisfaction. Her face remained as smooth and unreadable as ever, but deep within, a quiet, resonant hum of vindication vibrated. The sight of Lord Ashworth, his once imposing figure now a pathetic heap, his powdered wig askew, his face buried in a custard tart, was the culmination of weeks of meticulously applied, imperceptible torment. He had insulted her craftsmanship, questioned her intellect, and casually dismissed her humanity. And now, in front of the assembled court, his very body had betrayed him, a public, undeniable testament to his profound lack of repose. The Callaway motto, "Sleep is a privilege," had been vividly, unforgettably demonstrated. The nobleman's public humiliation was complete, a sweet, silent triumph achieved not by force or confrontation, but by the quiet, unshakable power of a perfectly and imperfectly made bed. The feast, designed to celebrate his grandeur, had instead showcased his spectacular, self-inflicted decline. Chapter 10. The servants' triumphant smirk, the collective gasp that had rippled through the grand hall of Blackwood Manor following Lord Ashworth's dramatic collapse into the custard tart, lingered in the air like a phantom chime, a fragile echo of astonishment. Lady Eleanor's strangled cry had quickly dissolved into a series of frantic, whispered commands, her face a mask of horrified mortification. Finch, the perpetually anxious valet, had indeed rushed forward, his usually immaculate uniform now threatened by the looming custard stain, his movements clumsy with a desperate urgency to salvage what little dignity remained of his master. The great hall, moments before a tableau of forced conviviality, had transformed into a scene of awkward frozen spectacle. Baron von Richter, his notoriously impassive face betraying a flicker of something akin to morbid fascination, leaned forward, a silent, almost predatory glint in his eye as he observed the prostrate nobleman, his powdered wig still askew, its artificial curls clinging precariously to a dollop of cream. Guests murmured, a low, unsettling buzz of hushed gossip and barely suppressed titters. Some averted their gaze, feigning polite concern, while others, less discreet, struggled to conceal smirks behind gloved hands or raised goblets. Lord Ashworth, roused from his accidental, albeit public, slumber by Finch's frantic tugging, let out a confused grunt, his face still half buried in the sugary confection. He blinked, his bloodshot eyes struggling to focus, and then, slowly, agonizingly, became aware of the sea of astonished, amused, and utterly mortified faces staring directly at him. A wave of comprehension, as cold and bracing as a winter torrent, washed over him, momentarily cutting through the fog of exhaustion. The realization of his spectacular public humiliation, the sheer, undeniable indignity of having dozed off, face first, into a dessert at his own grand banquet, struck him with the force of a physical blow. A faint flush, not of health, but of profound embarrassment, crept up his sallow cheeks. Finch, with the assistance of 2 footmen, managed to heave the sputtering, bewildered nobleman upright. Lord Ashworth stumbled, his velvet doublet now adorned with a sticky, cream-colored badge of dishonor. His wig, dislodged by the sudden motion, slipped sideways, and then with a soft plop, fell to the floor, leaving his balding pate gleaming unceremoniously in the candlelight. He mumbled incoherent apologies, his voice thick with shame and lingering sleep, before being hastily, almost forcibly, escorted from the hall, leaving behind a faint, sickeningly sweet scent of custard and a heavy pall of social disaster. Lady Eleonora, red-faced and trembling, offered a weak, stammered excuse about Lord Ashworth's sudden indisposition before hastily retiring herself, leaving the remnants of the banquet to dissolve into a flurry of whispered speculation and barely concealed amusement. Agnes, observing all this from her quiet station near the servants' passage, remained outwardly unmoving. Her plain features held their customary placidity, her hands remained clasped serenely before her starched apron. Yet, Deep within, a quiet, almost imperceptible tremor of profound satisfaction resonated. It was not a vulgar triumph, nor an angry exultation. It was something far deeper, far more resonant. It was the exquisite, intricate pleasure of seeing a meticulously crafted plan come to its perfectly logical, perfectly ironic conclusion. The sight of Lord Ashworth, once so puffed up with his own self-importance, now reduced to a stumbling, humiliated figure, his dignity literally smeared with custard, was a living testament to the Calloway motto, "Sleep is a privilege," and he, in his arrogance, had clearly proven himself unworthy of it. For Agnes, this was not merely revenge, it was an act of profound rebalancing. Generations of unseen labor, of quiet endurance, of casual dismissal, had found their voice in this single, spectacular collapse. The words he had so carelessly flung at her rudimentary, crude, no deeper than a puddle, now echoed with a chilling, self-fulfilling prophecy. His own lack of cerebral capacity had led him to overlook the quiet intelligence that now, quite literally, held his comfortable sleep hostage. The bed, the very symbol of his aristocratic comfort, had become the instrument of his undoing. And Agnes, the invisible architect, had orchestrated it with a precision that bordered on the sublime. The fallout from the banquet was immediate and profound. News, like a particularly virulent strain of influenza, spread with astonishing speed through the interconnected circles of the local gentry, and beyond. Lord Ashworth, once known for his wealth, and to a lesser extent his boorishness, was now the subject of widespread ridicule. The custard lord, as he was soon unflatteringly dubbed, became a cautionary tale, a punchline in drawing rooms, and a subject of mocking whispers in polite society. His once unassailable reputation, built on generations of inherited privilege, crumbled with a speed that mirrored his dramatic collapse. Invitations to social events dwindled, then ceased entirely. Visiting dignitaries, once eager to secure an audience with a man of his supposed influence, now found pressing engagements elsewhere. His attempts to restore his standing, to project an image of robust health and sharp wit, were pathetic and transparent. His voice, still hoarse from exhaustion, often cracked mid-sentence, and his eyes, perpetually bloodshot, betrayed the constant gnawing fatigue that still afflicted him. He would attempt to deliver an insightful political commentary at the local club, only to trail off into a vague, muddled complaint about phantom drafts, drawing thinly veiled snickers from his peers. Back at Blackwood Manor, Lord Ashworth's torment continued, relentless and unwavering. The sleep burrs and strategically placed feathers, the nuanced tensions in the sheets, these continued to perform their quiet work. But now they were augmented by the open, if discreet, amusement of the household staff. Cook Griselda's meals, while still containing their subtle digestive irritants, also acquired a new layer of ironic flair. She would occasionally serve dishes that were notoriously difficult to digest, or ones that required meticulous, delicate chewing. Knowing Lord Ashworth's increasingly frayed nerves would make the simple act of eating a challenge. Finch, the valet, no longer merely twisted threads. He would sometimes, with an almost imperceptible flourish, ensure Lord Ashworth's slippers were placed just out of reach of the bed, or that his morning tea was a fraction cooler than he preferred, knowing that these minor irritations would compound his master's already profound misery. Young Thomas, the stable boy, began to deliberately choose the most spirited, slightly unpredictable horses for Lord Ashworth's rides, knowing the jarring movements would further exacerbate his master's exhausted state. Even the scullery maids, who rarely saw Lord Ashworth directly, hummed a tuneless, mocking song about a sleepy lord and his sticky face as they went about their duties. The conspiracy, once courtly and subtle, now bordered on a pervasive, unspoken celebration of Lord Ashworth's decline. There was a lightness in the air of the servants' quarters, a quiet camaraderie forged in shared suffering, and now shared vicarious revenge. They saw the public humiliation as a vindication, a just retribution for years of unappreciated labor and thoughtless disdain. They watched him, their once imposing master, shrinking into a caricature of his former self, a man whose dignity had been utterly stripped, not by a grand gesture, but by 1,000 tiny, deliberate omissions of comfort. Lord Ashworth, in his growing isolation and profound exhaustion, became even more convinced of the pervasive curse. He would whisper to himself in his chamber, pacing the floorboards until the small hours, believing his every movement was monitored by unseen entities. He hired more alchemists, more spirit purifiers, who now openly ridiculed him in private while extracting vast sums for their increasingly absurd rituals. One particularly brazen charlatan even suggested that the curses was a manifestation of his own ancestors' displeasure, a spectral weight on his conscience which sent Lord Ashworth into a fresh paroxysm of terror and self-recrimination. He found himself unable to focus on his estates, his ledgers unread, his correspondence unanswered. Tenants complained, rents went unpaid, and the financial standing of Blackwood Manor, already precarious, began its own slow, irreversible decline. The prestige he so desperately clung to was eroding with every sleepless night, every public faux pas. Agnes, in her crisp, unblemished uniform, would see him at breakfast, his sallow face drawn, his eyes constantly darting, suspicious of every glance, every movement. He barely ate, his hands trembling as he lifted his cup. He would occasionally glance towards her, his gaze sweeping over her as if she were a piece of the furniture, her invisibility to him now complete. And in those moments, as she watched his slow, agonizing disintegration, a faint, almost imperceptible curve would touch the corners of Agnes' mouth. It was not a wide, joyful smile, for Agnes was not given to such overt expressions. It was something far more potent, a quiet, almost meditative smirk, laden with the weight of centuries of Callaway wisdom and the profound, enduring truth of their motto. His humiliation, both private and public, was the fruit of her labor. The loss of his reputation, the quiet, derisive laughter that now followed his name, was a far more exquisite form of retribution than any physical pain she could inflict. It struck at the very heart of his arrogance, dismantling the illusion of grandeur he had so carefully cultivated. He had deemed her rudimentary, but it was his own world, his own carefully constructed reality, that was now collapsing in a most rudimentary fashion. He had scorned her cerebral capacity, yet it was precisely that capacity, refined over generations, that had orchestrated his spectacular fall. The bed, his once sacred bastion of rest, remained the central instrument of his downfall. Each morning, Agnes would remake it, her fingers moving with the familiar surgical precision, subtly repositioning the burrs, reangling the quills, ensuring the elusive tension in the sheet. It was a daily ritual of quiet power, a silent declaration that the privilege of sleep, once so carelessly insulted, was now firmly within her control. Lord Ashworth, shivering in the cold comfort of his own ignorance, was a testament to the fact that sometimes the most dangerous people are those you never bother to truly see, those whose quiet diligence hides a sharp wit, a long memory, and an inherited art for making you pay, one excruciating, sleepless night at a time. His reputation, once formidable, now lay in tatters, much like his dignity, a messy, custard-stained tableau for all the world to see, a direct consequence of insulting a bed-making servant with a vengeance. Chapter 11. The Nobleman's Desperate Plea. The air within Blackwood Manor, once merely damp, now felt perpetually heavy, as though pressed down by the weight of Lord Ashworth's unending exhaustion. His once imposing figure had shrunk, his clothes hanging loosely on a frame that seemed to be slowly consumed by an invisible fire. His face, a roadmap of perpetually inflamed irritation, bore the sallow hue of old parchment, crisscrossed by a network of new, deeper lines etched by ceaseless nights. The public humiliation at the banquet, rather than serving as a necessary shock to his system, had only deepened his descent into a terrifying, self-perpetuating cycle of sleeplessness and paranoia. He no longer merely suspected a curse. He was absolutely convinced of it, believing it to be a sentient, malevolent entity that pursued him relentlessly, clinging to his very being, denying him the most fundamental of human comfort. His days were a grotesque parody of his former life. He would stumble from his bedchamber, his eyes wide and unfocused, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. His once booming voice had withered to a reedy whisper, punctuated by sudden, involuntary tremors. Dr. Sin, Pande formule diden pedisia criminaya. He ate almost nothing, convinced that every bite was poisoned, every sip of tea tainted. The other servants, once simply amused, now regarded him with a mixture of pity and a kind of quiet awe, watching the spectacular unraveling of a man who had once seemed utterly unassailable. Cook Griselda continued to subtly introduce her digestive irritants, though sometimes with a pang of something akin to guilt, seeing the nobleman's pitiful state. Finch, the valet, still insured a stray, chafing thread, found its way onto a nightshirt. But his hands shook almost as much as his master's. Even young Thomas, the stable boy, began to pick slightly less spirited horses for Lord Ashworth's rides, though the nobleman still found them jarring and uncomfortable, blaming the curse. Lord Ashworth's grand bedchamber, once a symbol of his wealth and comfort, had become a chamber of horrors. He no longer dared to strip the bed, fearing what unknown, cursed objects he might uncover. Instead, he would simply crawl into the perfectly made sheets, his body already bracing for the inevitable onset of phantom prickles, elusive lumps, and the maddening, unidentifiable drag of the linen. He would punch the pillows, claw at the sheets, and murmur desperate pleas to unseen forces, begging for respite, for a single unbroken hour of true sleep. His mind, deprived of rest, churned with increasingly vivid hallucinations. He saw shadows writhe on the walls, heard whispering voices in the stillness of the night, and often woke convinced that cold, unseen hands were prodding him, turning him, preventing him from settling into oblivion. His physician, Dr. Finchley, had long since abandoned his medical role, now acting more as a bewildered comforter, dispensing increasingly large doses of laudanum that merely knocked Lord Ashworth into a stupor, leaving him more disoriented upon waking. The alchemists and charlatans, having thoroughly drained his coffers, had departed, leaving him to battle his unseen tormentors alone. Lady Eleonora, mortified by his public disgrace and frightened by his escalating madness, had retreated to her own apartments, communicating with him only through Finch, offering only empty platitudes and vague suggestions of a country retreat. His political influence had evaporated, his business dealings were in ruins, and the financial stability of Blackwood Manor, once a given, now hung by a thread. He was a man utterly broken, stripped of his dignity, his health, his sanity, and, most cruelly, his sleep. One particularly bleak morning, after a night of relentless torment where he swore he could feel 1,000 tiny needles pricking his skin, and a persistent, unseen hand repeatedly pushing against his spine, Lord Ashworth stumbled from his bed. His legs felt like lead, his head throbbed, and his throat was raw from hours of incoherent muttering. He had not truly slept in weeks, perhaps months, only suffered through fragmented, agonized states of half-consciousness. He descended the grand staircase, not with his usual bluster, but with a desperate shuffling gait, his eyes scanning the empty hall with a frantic, haunted expression. He saw no one. The manor was quiet, wrapped in the familiar, hushed anticipation of morning duties. And then he saw her. Agnes. She was in the distant corner of the great hall, near the polished oak table, meticulously polishing a silver candelabrum, her back to him. Her movements were, as always, quiet, efficient, and precise. Her grey hair was coiled tightly at her nape, her starched apron crisp and unblemished. She was a figure of unwavering constancy in a world that had become utterly chaotic for him. For a long moment Lord Ashworth simply stood, swaying slightly, watching her. He had never truly seen Agnes, not in the way one sees a person. She had always been a fixture, a silent, unremarkable part of the furniture, as invisible to him as the dust motes in the air. He had insulted her, dismissed her, never once considering that such a quiet, unassuming presence could possess a will, a mind, or a memory capable of anything beyond the most mundane of tasks. But in his present state of profound despair, stripped of all arrogance and pretense, something shifted within him. He no longer saw a mere servant. He saw a constant. He saw a presence that had been with him through all his sleepless nights, all his frustrated mornings. He saw the only person who routinely touched his bed, who had access to its intimate details. His mind, frayed and desperate, began to grasp at the illogical, the inexplicable. Perhaps, he thought in his profound and self-pitying delusion, this quiet woman, this seemingly simple creature who possessed such an inexplicable talent for making his bed, held some secret. Perhaps she was unknowingly connected to the curse, or perhaps in her quiet wisdom she knew something he, in his arrogance, had overlooked. He shuffled forward, his steps echoing strangely loud in the quiet hall. Agnes did not immediately react. She continued to polish, her movements rhythmic and serene. "Agnes," he croaked, his voice a reedy whisper, barely recognizable as his own. Agnes paused. Slowly, deliberately, she turned, her placid gaze meeting his tormented one. Her eyes, usually downcast, held a depth that Lord Ashworth had never before perceived. There was no fear, no surprise, no anger in their depths, only a calm, unsettling neutrality. "My lord," she murmured, her voice soft, unassuming, yet perfectly clear in the silent hall. Lord Ashworth swallowed, his throat dry and constricted. He felt the cold sweat on his brow, the tremor in his hands. His years of aristocratic superiority, his carefully cultivated disdain for the lower orders, crumbled like ancient plaster. He saw only his misery, his desperation, and the quiet, unwavering presence before him. And then, in a moment of unprecedented raw humility, he dropped to his knees. It was not a graceful descent. It was a clumsy, undignified collapse, his weary body simply giving way. He reached out a trembling hand, clutching at the corner of her starched apron. "Agnes," he pleaded, his voice cracking thick with unshed tears. "Agnes, I beg you. I implore you. You are always there. You see everything. You touch my bed. You prepare my repose. This curse upon me, it is unrelenting. It drives me to madness. I cannot sleep, Agnes. I cannot rest. My very mind is unraveling." He looked up at her, his eyes wide and pleading, like those of a cornered, terrified animal. "I have consulted physicians, alchemists, charlatans of every stripe. They offer no succor, no relief. But you are always there. You are witness to my suffering. I beg you, Agnes, if you know of anything at all that might lift this torment, this terrible burden, tell me. Please, have mercy upon me. I am a broken man. I cannot endure another night." His words were a jumble of desperate entreaties, of fragmented thoughts, of profound self-pity and genuine fear. He was not asking her to cause him to sleep, for he still believed in the curse. He was simply begging for information, for a clue, for a way out of his personal hell, believing that someone so intimately connected to his bed, to his nightly routine, might possess some secret, some key to his torment, even if she herself was unaware of it. The idea that she could be the source of his anguish was a thought so utterly inconceivable to his aristocratic mind that it simply could not form. How could someone so rudimentary, so unremarkable, possess such profound, deliberate power? Agnes looked down at the crumpled figure of Lord Ashworth, kneeling before her, clutching her apron. Her face remained a perfect, unreadable mask, not a single muscle twitching, not a flicker of emotion in her eyes. The candelabrum, still gleaming in her hand, seemed almost an ironic symbol of the light she shed on his hidden torments. She saw not the arrogant nobleman who had once dismissed her, but a broken, pathetic shell, stripped bare of all his bluster and pride. His pleas, his self-abasing cries for mercy, resonated not with a sting, but with a deep, resonant chord of vindication within her. This was the fruit of her labor, the ultimate confirmation of the Calloway motto. He had come to understand, in the most painful and humiliating way possible, that sleep was indeed a privilege, and that he had, through his own actions, forfeited his claim to it. She remained silent for a long moment, allowing the full weight of his despair to settle in the quiet hole, allowing the sound of his ragged breathing to fill the space. Her gaze was not cruel but intensely observational, taking in every detail of his defeat. The trembling hands, the tear-streaked face, the utter brokenness of his spirit. She had achieved her objective with a precision that would have made her ancestors proud. The aristocratic man who had once deemed her intellect shallower than a puddle was now, quite literally, begging for salvation from the depths of his own self-created, invisible pond of misery. Finally, Agnes spoke, her voice still soft, still unassuming, yet with an almost imperceptible undercurrent of something deeply satisfying. "My lord," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I merely make the bed, as I always have." Her words were simple, factual, utterly devoid of any hint of the profound, ironic truth they contained. She then gently, meticulously, detached the corner of her apron from his trembling grasp, her touch as light and unobtrusive as ever. She turned back to her candelabrum, resuming her polishing with the steady, rhythmic movements of a woman utterly absorbed in her humble duties. Leaving Lord Ashworth still kneeling on the cold stone floor, utterly bewildered, entirely unaware that the source of his torment and the key to his redemption had just brushed past his fingers, unseen and unacknowledged. His plea for mercy, rendered with such raw, uncharacteristic humility, had landed not on deaf ears, but on ears that had heard centuries of such pleas, and a mind that understood the deep, abiding justice in its denial. Chapter 12. The servant's final lesson. The grand hall of Blackwood Manor, usually a cavern of echoing silence, save for the occasional creak of ancient timber or the distant murmur of the staff, seemed to hold its breath around the kneeling figure of Lord Ashworth. He remained there, hunched and pathetic, clutching at the hem of Agnes's apron, his desperate plea for mercy still hanging in the chilled morning air like a forgotten curse. His face, once a portrait of aristocratic disdain, was now a crumpled mask of exhaustion and raw, undiluted fear. His eyes, swollen and bloodshot, fixed upon Agnes with a terrifying intensity, searching for a flicker of recognition, a sign of understanding, anything that might explain the profound, unshakable torment that had consumed his nights, and, by extension, his very existence. Agnes had merely detached her apron from his trembling grasp, her touch as light and unobtrusive as a falling leaf, and returned to polishing the candelabrum. Her back was now to him, her movements resuming their meticulous rhythm, utterly serene, utterly dismissive. Lord Ashworth, still on his knees, felt a fresh wave of despair wash over him. His last thread of hope, the desperate notion that this quiet servant held some unconscious key to his suffering, had been summarily dismissed. He was truly alone in his misery, abandoned by doctors, alchemists, and now even the one unassuming soul who witnessed his nightly decline. The exhaustion a heavy cloak woven from weeks of fragmented sleep and invisible discomforts, pressed down on him with crushing weight. He felt himself swaying, the cold stone floor threatening to rise up and meet him. He might have remained there, a statue of self-pity and despair, had not Agnes, in a gesture so subtle it bordered on the telepathic, shifted her weight. It was a minute repositioning. Not a full turn, but enough to convey that she was, in fact, still aware of his presence, still observing. And then, without turning fully, her voice, soft yet remarkably clear, broke the silence once more. "My lord," she began, the words seeming to float on the still air, "you spoke of a curse." Her voice held no inflection of sympathy, no hint of accusation, merely a quiet, almost academic tone. She continued polishing, the rhythmic rub of cloth on silver the only accompaniment to her words. "You have spent weeks, months even, pursuing external explanations. Physicians with their humors and their leeches, alchemists with their moon spheres and their smoke. Even the good Baron von Richter, whom you so spectacularly introduced to the custard tart, would have sought answers in the stars or the alignment of planets. But the most profound truths, my lord, are often found in the most unremarkable places, in the quiet, unseen corners, in the hands that serve." Lord Ashworth, still on his knees, lifted his head slightly, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and a nascent, terrifying understanding. He swallowed hard, a dry, rasping sound. Agnes paused her polishing for a fraction of a second, her hands still. "You came to me, my lord, begging for mercy. For a truth, you said, and a truth you shall have. But not the truth of curses or humors, the truth of consequence." She finally turned, slowly, her placid gaze settling upon his crumpled form. There was no triumph in her eyes, no gloating, only a profound, unblinking clarity, an intelligence that now, unmistakably, pierced through the veil of her meek demeanor. Her voice, still soft, now possessed a quiet resonance, a pedagogical tone that brooked no interruption. "You spoke, my lord, of my cerebral capacity being no deeper than a puddle. A curious choice of words, given the intricate depths of observation and planning required to maintain a manner such as this, even in its quiet decline. And you spoke of my bed-making as rudimentary, crude, not fit for a pig in a sty. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor, not of anger, but of dry amusement, touched the corners of her mouth. Those words, my lord, were not forgotten. Indeed, they were catalogued with precision. Like every feather, every thread, every subtle adjustment in a perfectly made bed. Lord Ashworth stared, utterly transfixed, a cold dread seeping into his bones. The implication, though still abstract, was forming a chilling shape in his exhausted mind. "You see, my lord, sleep is a privilege." Agnes stated this not as a slogan, but as an undeniable fundamental law of the universe. It is a gift, a delicate balance, and it is a gift that can be, with equal precision, subtly withheld. For generations, my family, the Callaways, have understood this. We are not just bedmakers, my lord. We are, for want of a grander title, the comfort deniers, a silent lineage, dedicated to the meticulous rebalancing of what is carelessly taken for granted. She then began to explain, her voice calm, almost soothing, yet each word a pinprick of chilling revelation for Lord Ashworth. "You complained of a lump, my lord, that first morning. An imperceptible ripple. Yet it was enough, was it not, to warrant a dismissal of my years of perfected craft?" She paused, allowing the memory of his arrogant bluster to settle between them. "From that day, my lord, your bed became a canvas. A subtle tension here," she demonstrated with her hands, pulling an imaginary sheet taut with a precise, almost imperceptible twist of her wrist. A minute tug on the warp of the linen, creating a drag against the skin that cannot be seen, cannot be smoothed, but only felt. A phantom constraint, as you might have described it to Dr. Finchley. Lord Ashworth's mouth fell open, a silent gasp escaping him. The memories, the sensations, the weeks of torment, suddenly clicked into horrifying crystalline focus. And the pillows, my lord, Agnes continued, her gaze unwavering. You sought the perfect plumpness, yet a fraction more down. Gathered precisely off-center creates an infinitesimally denser spot, a ghost of a lump that nudges and teases, preventing true rest. Not enough to easily find and punch away, but quite enough to deny oblivion. She illustrated with a delicate, almost artistic fluffing motion of her hand. My grandmother, Elara, taught me the slight shift of the left hip, a method for creating a minute, persistent drag against the bottom sheet, preventing the complete release of muscle tension. And the ghost of a knot, a single, twisted thread that could create pressure on the smallest toe, too minor to fully wake, but too persistent to allow deep slumber. A shiver, not of cold, but of profound, existential horror, ran down Lord Ashworth's spine. He remembered the phantom grip on his leg, the inexplicable pressure on his toes. Then came the curse, as you termed it, Agnes murmured. A faint, dry chuckle, barely audible, escaping her lips. You believed it a malevolent entity, and indeed it was, but one woven of finely crushed thistle fibers and barbed nettle hairs, sifted to an innocuous dust. She mimed a delicate sprinkling motion. Invisible, unidentifiable. Yet, as your body's warmth and friction worked upon them through the night, they would prickle and tease, an itch without a visible source, driving you to scratch yourself raw, believing in invisible fleas. Lord Ashworth's hands flew to his arms, to his neck where faint, red marks of his nocturnal scratching still remained. The humiliation of his frantic, fruitless searches under his sheets, the accusations of invisible mites, now crashed upon him with overwhelming force. And the feathers, my lord, you complained of a bed of thorns, a particularly resonant complaint, given their source. Not sharp enough to pierce, but quite enough to prod. A specific goose quill, subtly reoriented, its firmer tip angled just so, beneath the surface of the pillow, or embedded within the mattress, ticking itself, creating a constant localized pressure, a stubborn pebble, always in a new, maddening spot. The elastic sigh, a favorite of my great-uncle Thomas, a nearly invisible elastic thread, subtly stitched into the pillow casing, designed to resist the natural flattening, pushing back with an almost imperceptible pressure against the head, causing chronic neck stiffness. His neck, his aching neck, which Dr. Finchley had blamed on drafts and humors. Lord Ashworth felt bile rise in his throat. He looked at Agnes, this quiet, unassuming woman, seeing her now not as a servant, but as a terrifying, meticulous architect of his suffering. A daemon of domesticity. You found your food unaccountably heavy, my lord, Agnes continued, her voice gaining a touch of ironic satisfaction. Cook Griselda, a woman whose culinary genius you dismissed as fit only for scullery dogs, added a mild gastric unease to your stews, a contribution to your restless nights. You found your clothes strangely irritating. Finch, your valet, whose lack of dexterity you so often lamented, ensured a subtle roughness, a minute chafing thread in your nightshirts and a barely there tightness in your nightcap. Even your horse, you believed, delighted in jostling your fragile constitution. Young Thomas, the stable boy whose spirit you often crushed, merely ensured your saddle was set a fraction off-center, or chose a horse that would gently but persistently jar your sleep-deprived frame. Agnes paused, allowing the full weight of the courtly conspiracy to settle upon Lord Ashworth. He saw it all now, the shared glances among the servants, the knowing smirks, the quiet amusement that had underpinned his every waking and sleeping moment. His entire world, his grand illusions of power and unassailable authority, had been meticulously dismantled by the very people he deemed beneath him, those he had casually, cruelly dismissed. "And your public display at the banquet, my lord," Agnes concluded, her voice now softer. "Almost contemplative, your face in the custard tart? That too was a consequence. A consequence of weeks of meticulously applied, imperceptible discomforts. A consequence of denying yourself the privilege of true rest, through your words, through your actions, through your fundamental inability to see those who serve you as anything more than extensions of your own desires." She finally met his gaze, her eyes holding his with an unwavering, almost pitying intensity. "You sought a cosmic curse, my lord. You blamed the stars, the moon, your humors. But the truth, as it so often is, was far more prosaic and far more satisfying." Lord Ashworth crumpled further, a whimpering sound escaping his lips. His mind, already shattered by exhaustion, could not cope with the magnitude of this revelation. The curse was real, but it was not cosmic. It was human. It was domestic. It was Agnes. And the realization, the horrifying, crushing understanding that his suffering was entirely self-inflicted, a direct consequence of his own arrogance, by the hands of the most unremarkable person in his household, utterly broke him. His pride, his dignity, his very sense of self, collapsed around him like a house of cards. Agnes watched him for a long moment, allowing the full measure of his understanding to sink in. She saw the profound, raw shame, the utter despair in his eyes. Her purpose was complete. The lesson had been delivered, dryly, humorously, and with devastating effectiveness. She had rebalanced the scales not with brute force but with quiet intellect and generational artistry. Then, with a faint, almost imperceptible sigh, Agnes returned to her candelabrum. She picked up her polishing cloth, and with the gentle, rhythmic movements that had defined her existence and driven Lord Ashworth to the brink of madness, she resumed her work. The silver gleamed under her touch, reflecting the pale morning light. The quiet hum of the manor returned, undisturbed by the silent, agonizing breakdown of its master. Lord Ashworth remained on the cold floor, whimpering, a broken man in the grand hall of his crumbling legacy. Finally, agonizingly, aware of the meticulous hands that had woven his torment. And Agnes, the unassuming servant, polished on, her face serene, her internal smirk complete, a quiet testament to the enduring power of those who are seen, yet never truly observed. Chapter 13. The Nobleman's Restless Legacy. The silence that followed Agnes's quiet, devastating revelation in the grand hall of Blackwood Manor was not merely the absence of sound. It was the suffocating weight of a truth too terrible to bear, a truth that settled upon Lord Ashworth like a shroud woven of his own arrogance. He remained there, hunched and pathetic, clutching at the hem of Agnes's apron, his desperate plea for mercy still hanging in the chilled morning air like a forgotten curse. His face, once a portrait of aristocratic disdain, was now a crumpled mask of exhaustion and raw, undiluted fear. His eyes, swollen and bloodshot, fixed upon Agnes with a terrifying intensity, searching for a flicker of recognition, a sign of understanding, anything that might explain the profound, unshakable torment that had consumed his nights and, by extension, his very existence. Agnes had merely detached her apron from his trembling grasp, her touch as light and unobtrusive as a falling leaf, and returned to polishing the candelabrum. Her back was now to him, her movements resuming their meticulous rhythm, utterly serene, utterly dismissive. Lord Ashworth, still on his knees, felt a fresh wave of despair wash over him. His last thread of hope, the desperate notion that this quiet servant held some unconscious key to his suffering, had been summarily dismissed. He was truly alone in his misery, abandoned by doctors, alchemists, and now even the one unassuming soul who witnessed his nightly decline. The exhaustion, a heavy cloak woven from weeks of fragmented sleep, and invisible discomforts, pressed down on him with crushing weight. He felt himself swaying, the cold stone floor threatening to rise up and meet him. He might have remained there, a statue of self-pity and despair, had not Agnes, in a gesture so subtle it bordered on the telepathic, shifted her weight. It was a minute repositioning, not a full turn, but enough to convey that she was, in fact, still aware of his presence, still observing. And then, without turning fully, her voice, soft yet remarkably clear, broke the silence once more. "My lord," she began, the words seeming to float on the still air, "you spoke of a curse." Her voice held no inflection of sympathy, no hint of accusation, merely a quiet, almost academic tone. She continued polishing, the rhythmic rub of cloth on silver the only accompaniment to her words. "You have spent weeks, months even, pursuing external explanations. Physicians, with their humors and their leeches, alchemists, with their moon spheres and their smoke. Even the good Baron von Richter, whom you so spectacularly introduced to the custard tart, would have sought answers in the stars or the alignment of planets. But the most profound truths, my lord, are often found in the most unremarkable places, in the quiet, unseen corners, in the hands that serve." Lord Ashworth, still on his knees, lifted his head slightly, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and a nascent, terrifying understanding. He swallowed hard, a dry, rasping sound. Agnes paused her polishing for a fraction of a second, her hands still. "You came to me, my lord, begging for mercy. For a truth, you said, and a truth you shall have. But not the truth of curses or humors, the truth of consequence." She finally turned, slowly, her placid gaze settling upon his crumpled form. There was no triumph in her eyes, no gloating, only a profound, unblinking clarity, an intelligence that now, unmistakably, pierced through the veil of her meek demeanor. Her voice, still soft, now possessed a quiet resonance, a pedagogical tone that brooked no interruption. "You spoke, my lord, of my cerebral capacity being no deeper than a puddle. A curious choice of words, given the intricate depths of observation and planning required to maintain a manner such as this, even in its quiet decline. And you spoke of my bed-making as rudimentary, crude, not fit for a pig in a sty. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor, not of anger but of dry amusement, touched the corners of her mouth. Those words, my lord, were not forgotten. Indeed, they were catalogued, with precision. Like every feather, every thread, every subtle adjustment in a perfectly made bed. Lord Ashworth stared, utterly transfixed, a cold dread seeping into his bones. The implication, though still abstract, was forming a chilling shape in his exhausted mind. "You see, my lord, sleep is a privilege." Agnes stated this not as a slogan, but as an undeniable fundamental law of the universe. It is a gift, a delicate balance, and it is a gift that can be, with equal precision, subtly withheld. For generations, my family, the Calloways, have understood this. We are not just bed-makers, my lord. We are, for want of a grander title, the comfortineers, a silent lineage, dedicated to the meticulous rebalancing of what is carelessly taken for granted. She then began to explain, her voice calm, almost soothing, yet each word a pinprick of chilling revelation for Lord Ashworth. "You complain of a lump, my lord, my lord." That first morning, an imperceptible ripple, Yet it was enough, was it not, to warrant a dismissal of my years of perfected craft? She paused, allowing the memory of his arrogant bluster to settle between them. From that day, my lord, your bed became a canvas. A subtle tension here, she demonstrated with her hands, pulling an imaginary sheet taut with a precise, almost imperceptible twist of her wrist. A minute tug on the warp of the linen, creating a drag against the skin that cannot be seen, cannot be smoothed. It only felt a phantom constraint, as you might have described it to Dr. Finchley. Lord Ashworth's mouth fell open, a silent gasp escaping him. The memories, the sensations, the weeks of torment, suddenly clicked into horrifying, crystalline focus. And the pillows, my lord, Agnes continued, her gaze unwavering. You sought the perfect plumpness. Yet a fraction more down, gathered precisely off-center, creates an infinitesimally denser spot, a ghost of a lump that nudges and teases, preventing true rest. Not enough to easily find and punch away, but quite enough to deny oblivion. She illustrated with a delicate, almost artistic fluffing motion of her hand. My grandmother, Elara, taught me the slight shift of the left hip, a method for creating a minute, persistent drag against the bottom sheet, preventing the complete release of muscle tension, and the ghost of a knot, a single twisted thread that could create pressure on the smallest toe, too minor to fully wake, but too persistent to allow deep slumber. A shiver, not of cold, but of profound existential horror, ran down Lord Ashworth's spine. He remembered the phantom grip on his leg, the inexplicable pressure on his toes. Then came the curse, as you termed it, Agnes murmured, a faint, dry chuckle, barely audible, escaping her lips. You believed it a malevolent entity. And indeed it was, but one woven of finely crushed thistle fibers and barbed nettle hairs, sifted to an innocuous dust. She mimed a delicate sprinkling motion. Invisible, unidentifiable. Yet, as your body's warmth and friction worked upon them through the night, they would prickle and tease, an itch without a visible source, driving you to scratch yourself raw, believing in invisible fleas. Lord Ashworth's hands flew to his arms, to his neck where faint red marks of his nocturnal scratching still remained, the humiliation of his frantic, fruitless searches under his sheets. The accusations of invisible mites now crashed upon him with overwhelming force. And the feathers. My lord, you complained of a bed of thorns. A particularly resonant complaint, given their source. Not sharp enough to pierce, but quite enough to prod. A specific goose quill, subtly reoriented, its firmer tip angled just so, beneath the surface of the pillow, or embedded within the mattress, ticking itself, creating a constant, localized pressure, a stubborn pebble, always in a new, maddening spot. The elastic sigh, a favorite of my great-uncle Thomas, a nearly invisible elastic thread, subtly stitched into the pillow casing, designed to resist the natural flattening, pushing back with an almost imperceptible pressure against the head, causing chronic neck stiffness. His neck, his aching neck, which Dr. Finchley had blamed on draughts and humors. Lord Ashworth felt bile rise in his throat. He looked at Agnes, this quiet, unassuming woman, seeing her now not as a servant, but as a terrifying, meticulous architect of his suffering, a daemon of domesticity. You found your food unaccountably heavy, my lord, Agnes continued, her voice gaining a touch of ironic satisfaction. Cook Grisella, a woman whose culinary genius you dismissed as fit only for scullery dogs, added a mild gastric unease to your stews, a contribution to your restless nights. You found your clothes strangely irritating. Finch, your valet, whose lack of dexterity you so often lamented, ensured a subtle roughness, a minute chafing thread in your nightshirts, and a barely there tightness in your nightcap. Even your horse, you believed, delighted in jostling your fragile constitution. Young Thomas, the stable boy whose spirit you often crushed, merely ensured your saddle was set a fraction off-center, or chose a horse that would gently, but persistently, your sleep-deprived frame. Agnes paused, allowing the full weight of the courtly conspiracy to settle upon Lord Ashworth. He saw it all now. The shared glances among the servants, the knowing smirks, the quiet amusement that had underpinned his every waking and sleeping moment. His entire world, his grand illusions of power and unassailable authority, had been meticulously dismantled by the very people he deemed beneath him, those he had casually, cruelly dismissed. "And your public display at the banquet, my lord," Agnes concluded, her voice now softer, almost contemplative, your face in the custard tart. That, too, was a consequence of weeks of meticulously applied, imperceptible discomforts, a consequence of denying yourself the privilege of true rest, through your words, through your actions, through your fundamental inability to see those who serve you as anything more than extensions of your own desires. She finally met his gaze, her eyes holding his with an unwavering, almost pitying intensity. "You sought a cosmic curse, my lord. You blamed the stars, the moon, your humors. But the truth, as it so often is, was far more prosaic, and far more satisfying." Lord Ashworth crumpled further, a whimpering sound escaping his lips. His mind, already shattered by exhaustion, could not cope with the magnitude of this revelation. The curse was real, but it was not cosmic. It was human. It was domestic. It was Agnes. And the realization, the horrifying, crushing understanding that his suffering was entirely self-inflicted, a direct consequence of his own arrogance, by the hands of the most unremarkable person in his household, utterly broke him. His pride, his dignity, his very sense of self, collapsed around him like a house of cards. Agnes watched him for a long moment, allowing the full measure of his understanding to sink in. She saw the profound, raw shame, the utter despair in his eyes. Her purpose was complete. The lesson had been delivered dryly, humorously, and with devastating effectiveness. She had rebalanced the scales, not with brute force, but with quiet intellect and generational artistry. Then, with a faint, almost imperceptible sigh, Agnes returned to her candelabrum. She picked up her polishing cloth, and with the gentle, rhythmic movements that had defined her existence and driven Lord Ashworth to the brink of madness, she resumed her work. The silver gleamed under her touch, reflecting the pale morning light. The quiet hum of the manor returned, undisturbed by the silent, agonizing breakdown of its master. Lord Ashworth remained on the cold floor, whimpering, a broken man in the grand hall of his crumbling legacy, finally, agonizingly aware of the meticulous hands that had woven his torment. And Agnes, the unassuming servant, polished on, her face serene, her internal smirk complete, a quiet testament to the enduring power of those who are seen, yet never truly observed. Chapter 13. The Nobleman's Restless Legacy. The profound silence that descended upon the grand hall of Blackwood Manor following Agnes' quiet, devastating revelation was unlike any silence Lord Ashworth had ever known. It was not the gentle hush of a sleeping house, nor the respectful quiet of a watchful staff. It was the oppressive, suffocating silence of absolute truth, a truth that had shattered the very foundations of his reality. He remained on the cold, polished stone floor, a crumpled, pathetic heap, the hem of Agnes' apron still clinging to his trembling fingers as a desperate, unheeded plea. His face, once so quick to sneer, was now a mask of pure, unadulterated horror, his eyes wide and vacant, staring at the polished silver candelabrum, in Agnes' serene hand, as if it were a weapon, which, in the metaphorical sense, it most certainly was. Agnes had not offered further words of comfort or explanation. Her lesson delivered, Her purpose fulfilled, she had simply detached her apron from his clammy grasp with the gentle, unobtrusive touch of a woman adjusting a stray thread. She had then turned her back to him, resuming the meticulous polishing of the candelabrum. Her movements fluid and unhurried, as if the profound collapse of a nobleman's sanity was merely a minor interlude in the daily rhythm of domestic duty. The rhythmic rub of cloth on silver was the only sound for a long, agonizing moment, a quiet counterpoint to the ragged, shallow gasps that escaped Lord Ashworth's throat. He did not rise immediately. The physical exhaustion, accumulated over weeks of meticulously engineered sleeplessness, held him captive. But it was the crushing weight of the revelation that truly paralyzed him. The curse, the malevolent force he had so vehemently believed in, was not cosmic. It was not supernatural. It was domestic. It was human. It was Agnes. The woman he had so carelessly dismissed as having no cerebral capacity deeper than a puddle had, with her profound intellect and her generational artistry, orchestrated his spectacular downfall. The full, horrifying irony of it all settled upon him, a chilling blanket woven from every slight, every casual cruelty, every dismissive word he had ever uttered to the unseen hands that served him. His own arrogance had become the very instrument of his torment, a masterpiece of quiet vengeance. When Lord Ashworth finally managed to push himself up, it was not with his usual bluster, but with a series of jerky, uncertain movements, like an automaton whose gears had rusted. His legs trembled, his head swam, and his stomach churned with a sudden violent nausea, a phantom echo of Cook Griselda's quiet contributions to his misery. He stood for a moment, swaying, his gaze fixed on Agnes' back. He wanted to shout, to rage, to demand that she undo this unspeakable wrong, but the words withered in his throat. What could he say? She had merely stated the truth, the plain, unadorned truth, in a voice as soft and unassuming as the rustle of a clean sheet. He could not refute it, for the physical evidence of his suffering, the sleepless nights, the phantom pains, the public humiliation, was undeniably real. From that day forward, Lord Ashworth's life at Blackwood Manor became a living, breathing cautionary tale, a testament to the enduring power of a vengeful servant. His public disgrace at the banquet had already cemented his reputation as the Custard Lord, a figure of ridicule and pity in society. But his private life, within the draughty halls of his own home, devolved into a new, far more profound form of torment. The torment of knowing. He still possessed his grand bedchamber, his fine linens, his soft mattress, but they had become symbols not of comfort, but of existential dread. Agnes continued to make his bed each morning, as she always had. Her movements remained precise, her face unreadable, and for the most part, the active, subtle acts of sabotage ceased. The burrs, the strategically placed feathers, the phantom tensions, these were largely removed, or at least no longer introduced with the same malicious intent. For Agnes, the primary lesson had been delivered, the rebalancing achieved. The target was no longer his physical discomfort, but his shattered psyche. And for that, the mere potential of discomfort, amplified by his knowledge, was far more potent. Lord Ashworth now lived in a state of perpetual agonizing suspicion. Each evening as he prepared for bed, a ritual that had once been a simple prelude to repose became an obsessive, prolonged ordeal. He would approach his bed, not with anticipation, but with trepidation. He would strip the bed himself, flinging back the heavy blankets, pulling at the crisp sheets with frantic, trembling hands, his bloodshot eyes scanning every inch of the pristine linen for a telltale lump, a stray feather, a thread twisted just so. He would run his hands over the mattress, prodding, pushing, searching for any subtle unevenness in the down. He would hold each pillow to the light, feeling for stray quills, shaking them vigorously, convinced he could detect the minute displacement Agnes had so meticulously explained. He would then, with painstaking slowness, remake the bed himself, attempting to achieve a perfection he now knew to be both elusive and potentially treacherous. He would smooth the sheets, only to find an imagined ripple under his fingers. He would fluff a pillow, only to convince himself a minute, unyielding point remained. His nights, therefore, were no less tormented. Though the active agents of discomfort were often absent, his mind, now irreversibly poisoned by Agnes' truth, supplied its own torments. He would lie awake, rigid with anxiety, convinced he felt a prickle that wasn't there, a lump that vanished when he probed for it, a subtle drag that was merely the natural weight of the sheet. He would shift, turn, and sit bolt upright, convinced he had just identified the source of his misery, only to find nothing. The paranoia, once a vague fear of a curse, had transformed into a specific, tangible terror of Agnes' unseen hand, a hand that might at any moment weave anew imperceptible agony into his sleep. He continued to age rapidly, his hair thinning further, his once robust frame now gaunt and stooped. His reputation remained in tatters, the custard lord cautionary tale whispered among the gentry, a stark reminder of the perils of hubris. His wealth, already dwindling due to his neglect of his estates and his extravagant payments to charlatans, continued its precipitous decline. Lady Eleonora, fearing social ruin, spent increasing amounts of time at her sister's estate, leaving Lord Ashworth alone in Blackwood Manor, haunted by the rustle of sheets and the imagined whispers of his tormentors. The other servants, witnessing Lord Ashworth's ongoing, self-inflicted misery, no longer felt the need for their own petty acts of sabotage. His suffering, now born of pure paranoia, was far more satisfying than anything they could inflict. They observed his nightly rituals of bed inspection with quiet, knowing glances, a subtle shared triumph in their eyes. Agnes in particular would occasionally catch Lord Ashworth, stripping his bed in the pale morning light, his back aching, his face a picture of despair. She would nod almost imperceptibly, a faint, fleeting curve touching the corners of her mouth, not a smirk of cruelty, but one of profound, quiet vindication. Her lesson had been learned, etched into the very fabric of his being. Years passed, blurring into a monotonous succession of restless nights and weary days for Lord Ashworth. He never truly slept again, not in the deep, restorative oblivion that is sleep's true gift. He existed in a perpetual twilight of exhaustion, his waking hours consumed by the meticulous, futile inspection of his bed, his nights by the phantom sensations of an unseen hand. He became a recluse, a ghost in his own manner, a living monument to the wisdom of the Callaway motto. One cold, quiet morning, Lord Ashworth did not emerge from his bedchamber. Finch, finding the door ajar, discovered him stiff and cold, lying perfectly still in his perfectly made bed, his hands clasped over his chest, as if guarding against some final, imagined discomfort. The sheets were smooth, the pillows plump. There was not a wrinkle, not a lump, not a single visible imperfection. His face, in death, seemed finally at peace, perhaps having at last found the undisturbed repose that had so relentlessly eluded him in life. Agnes, as was her duty, came to prepare the chamber for the removal of the body. She looked at the deceased nobleman, his face serene in its finality. She smoothed the sheet over his still form, her fingers brushing the linen with their customary precision. She felt no malice, no lingering resentment, only a profound sense of completion. The scales had been balanced, the lesson learned. A few weeks later, with the affairs of the manor in disarray and Lady Eleonora planning a swift departure to a more fashionable dwelling, Agnes received an unexpected summons. A distant relative, a cousin from a branch of the Callaway family she had not seen in decades, sought her counsel. A new posting was available at a sprawling country estate in the west, where the noble family, the Barons de Valois, were known for their ancient lineage and their exacting standards. But one particular baron, a certain Lord Armand de Valois, had gained a rather peculiar reputation. He was a man of considerable wealth, and even more considerable arrogance, renowned throughout the county for his disdain for what he termed excessive fluff. He would often complain loudly and publicly that his pillows were like suffocating clouds, designed for children or weak-willed poets, not for a man of his robust constitution, and would insist on having them beaten flat, almost board-like, before he could attempt to rest his noble head. He even possessed a peculiar habit of sending his personal bedmaker to stand in the corner for hours, if a pillow showed even the slightest hint of plumpness in the morning. Agnes listened to the description of Lord Armand de Valois with her customary placid expression. She heard the complaints, the disdain, the casual cruelty directed at those who served his comfort. She heard, too, the echo of another nobleman's words, long since buried beneath a mound of custard. A faint, almost imperceptible curve touched the corners of her mouth, a familiar, knowing smirk that was entirely her own. She thought of the perfect plumpness of a goose-down pillow, of the subtle techniques for distributing the feathers just so. She thought of the elastic sigh, and the myriad ways to introduce a firm, unyielding presence beneath a noble head. She nodded, her decision made. Blackwood Manor's chapter was closed. A new one, it seemed, was about to begin. The privilege of sleep, a truth she carried in her quiet hands, was about to find a new, unwitting recipient. And Agnes, the unassuming servant, would ensure the lesson in its quiet, humorous, and deeply unsettling way would be learned anew.